Thanks so much for having us. My name is Jess Dahlman. My sign name is Jess. I am a licensed professional counselor in my primary role. But I came to counseling actually through education. I happened to do a Teach for America program in New Mexico and ended up working on the Dene Reservation, teaching deaf and hard of hearing students who were mainstreamed, most of whom had not had appropriate access to educational services until I was there. So my primary experience was actually, working with kids with typical intelligence, typical development, who were like 13, 15, 16, who never had really great language access and had a whole slew of behavioral and emotional issues in school because of the isolation that they experienced. And most of my time in teaching was actually doing emotional first aid, helping them cope, helping them regulate, helping them manage their emotions so that they could possibly learn, and collaborating with the New Mexico School for the Deaf and collaborating with deaf mentors and collaborating with licensed counselors who could come in to the school and do the formal mental health work. And that is part of what made me go back to grad school and become a counselor, and really be able to provide direct service in English, ASL, or in Spanish.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Elizabeth Seeliger, and I come to this work as a doctor of audiology, and as the Early Hearing Detection and Intervention Program Director for the state of Wisconsin. So I'm your border state neighbor, and work very closely with your Illinois Early Hearing Detection and Intervention Program, and have known those folks for a long time. But I actually came to this work because I have always been fascinated in parent-child relationships, and especially parent-child relationships across perceived or real differences. So I am adopted out of the Wisconsin foster care system, and I also have a child who's adopted out of an international orphanage. And so through those experiences, I was really interested in how deaf babies and hearing parents would learn to be a unit that could communicate effortlessly. And so I'm sort of coined as saying communication only develops in the context of primary relationships. Without relationship, we don't have a purpose for communication, right? And so through that program in Wisconsin, we have a huge infant mental health focus on our EDDI program, really looking at how do we mitigate diagnostic trauma, how do we help families understand and learn to be together from the very start. So I think Jess and I are both infant mental health certified and endorsed, and are really interested in how we make this system from the very beginning work to enhance parent-child relationships, not to get in the way and interrupt them. And that's a little bit of how we're coming to this content today. So even our presentation title, "Don't Just Do Something, Stand There," is kind of one of the tenets of infant mental health. And so we're going to be kind of talking through that lens all day today.
I want to know who's in the room a little bit. So who are my early education folks? Work with young kids. Okay. How about middle schoolers, middle-aged, middle range? Yeah. High schoolers, adolescents. Who does it all? Anybody who does preschool in here? Really littles? Okay. Most of you do a lot of it. Okay. Who are my school social workers or people doing the mental health stuff? Okay, great. Any administrators? Anybody leadership? Yeah. Okay, great. Anybody we missed? Any other roles?
Any parents of kids who are deaf or hard of hearing?
Parents of kids who are deaf or hard of hearing? Anybody dual? No? Okay. Who in the room signs fluently? Who feels pretty comfortable with their sign? Okay. Okay, great. Just a little intellectual property disclaimer, and then wanting to acknowledge the objectives for today. Whether you knew it or not when you signed up or when you came into this room, this is a trauma-informed care training. So, basic introduction to the signs and symptoms of trauma. And this is really important, I think, especially in the classroom, because when we as teachers, facilitators, social workers, people supporting youth are frustrated or struggling with any layer of bias, we often will see signs and symptoms of trauma as bad behavior or disrespect, or as other things that are just undesirable character traits. And part of today is really helping us ground and reframe, and most of those are signs and symptoms of stress and trauma. Being able to acknowledge the trauma-informed care principles, acknowledging different types of trauma. So since the beginning of the pandemic, since school is going back to in-person, this is really different. I mean, it's the same, but it's also really different because the percentage of kids who are struggling is just way higher. The percentage of colleagues who are struggling is way higher. So the average agitation level and the sense of urgency around this topic is also higher. So we also just want to acknowledge that coming into the space, that we want to solve this. We want to, we see that we're stressed out by seeing how prevalent it is, and it just creates a different tone to the presentation. We want to acknowledge that there's a parallel process between trauma, resilience, recovery, and systems, that they all influence each other. We've been saying, we've been doing presentations like this for about, 7 years together, and recently in the research, some of the big names like Bessel van der Kolk or Gabor Mate are saying some similar things with their research, that trauma over time can become a family trait, right? Like the family stressors, family agitation, like the way that trauma intergenerationally passes on. And when multiple families experience that or share it in a community, it can look like culture, right? Like it can look like work culture. It can look like culture from a standard culture concept. It can look like subculture, that trauma passes down and is shared because humans are experiential creatures. We only know what we know until we know something different. So recovery and healing is never an individual process. When you support yourself to heal or to be more regulated, you change your entire classroom. You change your entire family, right? And then the ripple can go backwards as far as how we change work culture and how we change communities as well. And forward into new generations. From an epigenetics perception, trauma isn't the only thing that's passed down intergenerationally, right? So is resilience. So is the impulse to thrive and to survive. We'll talk about some different strategies. And part of that is really starting with orienting to the day. Who's familiar with orienting as a trauma-informed practice? Okay, so the orienting response is an impulse, a somatic response to keep us safe. So if there was the smell of smoke coming from the back of the room, or a loud bang, or if a bunch of commotion came from back there, the entire room would orient to that space. Or if you are familiar with being outside in nature, if something in nature disrupts what's happening, all the birds will orient, all the deer will orient. They'll orient because it's necessary to keep us safe. So we can intentionally orient to help us check in, how safe are we? What is the degree of safety that might be possible in a context? So how many of you are aware of where the exit doors are? Yeah, some of you had to think about it, but some of you were like, yep, I know exactly where the exit doors are. That's a basic unconscious orientation. Some of you might have chosen your spots consciously or unconsciously in proximity to the doors. Also a basic orientation thing that we do. On perceived safety. The restrooms are just outside of these doors, so they're quite close. Food and drinks at the back. We have a number of different fidgets and things on the tables. So there's coloring pages. Some tables have colored pencils. Some of them have markers. I tried to alternate so you can turn around and interact with the table behind you or in front of you and share coloring devices. One of the things around orientation is that adult learners need to fidget. Adult learners need to multitask. Even the impulse to open your laptops was I'm safer if my laptop is open. I have guaranteed distraction. I can multitask, whatever the layers are in that as a way to orient. But sometimes groups are really hesitant to interact with the fidgets or the nature objects. Please intentionally try to interact with them because there's so much pressure in professionalism to sit still. There's so much pressure in performance culture to not play, to contain, to look a certain way. And humans, again, need to move, need to do things. The more you move, the more you engage your own systems that help you focus, the more likely you'll actually learn something today, okay? So it's a big room. We're really slowing down. We hope that this feels different than what it feels like to go to work. We hope that it feels different than standard presentations. And that might be a welcome different, and it might be like, ooh, I'm uncomfortable because it's different. Just notice. Again, that's why we're slowing down. That's the invitation to observe and listen deeply. Observe yourself, observe your colleagues, reflect on the youth that you work with. You want to take some of the next ones?
I just want to add to what you said about the fidgets, that there's a wide variety of them. And so, the things that you feel initially drawn to, encourage your own exploration of other things because bodies react differently. Some of them will be down-regulating for you. Some of them will be up-regulating. And it's really helpful to know what helps you because it allows you to be more empathetic with your students, to be like, oh, pokeballs, ew. Right? But maybe other people are like, oh yeah, that's the thing that helps me. So this is not only about self-discovery and self-learning, but also about raising awareness of how different students might interface and interact with things as well. So our topic is trauma-informed care. And so inherently, we're going to be talking about trauma. And one of our shared deep belief systems is that the kind of societal expectation that we leave part of ourself at home and then we show up in this other body as a professional is completely impossible and just a false myth. We are who we are in all of our contexts, right? And actually, the more embodied and in touch with who we are in our work context, the more fully we can show up for the kids that we care about. And so part of today is to explore, let me ask you, how many of you are parents to children yourself? Okay. How many of you have been parented? Right? Everybody. So the ways in which we have experienced being parented actually shows up in how we care and take care of other people. And it influences whether we want it to or not, how we parent our own children. So like your whole self is invited to be in this room, not just your professional self. So think about how you're going to show up today. Where do you feel like you can stretch and lean into your own vulnerability? That was part of the reason we had an explicit agreement about the videotaping. Like this room, you can perceive your own sense of safety. It's a whole different thing to think that your commentary is going to be out there on the web for anybody to hear or see. And so it has been a very explicit requirement that anytime somebody offers something into this space, it is not part of the videotape that goes out beyond this room. Okay. So stay engaged. This is part of the fidgets as a way to stay engaged. We know you have other responsibilities outside of here, and phones are a necessary connection to people you love on the outside world. We just ask you to be really aware. This is your opportunity to drop into presence. And so if you find yourself wanting to, that compulsive like, but what's on Facebook? What's on Instagram? Whatever. Just like notice that and then ask yourself why. Like what's happening right now in my body or in this room that's making me want to check out. Okay? It's a coping strategy and it's a often mindless escape. So this is your opportunity to just check in and be aware of like why and when are you feeling drawn to being outside of this room. So we have 4 hours today. Oftentimes Jess and I present for 2 days. So this is going to be like dipping our toe in the water of trauma-informed care, and that's okay. And there's probably going to be things that open up today because we're going to be talking about things like oppression and bias and trauma. This is not going to get wrapped up in a neat and tidy bow. This is probably going to leave you with more questions than answers. We're hopeful that it will give you something to go back to your teams and your schools and just be thoughtful out of and start new conversations, potentially. Any questions about any of those before I keep going? No? We all feeling like we can agree to the ones that we've discussed so far? Okay. Practice non-judgment. This is often first thought of as not judging other people, but here's a little truth bomb. We are most judgmental of ourselves. That is where judgment starts. And so again, an opportunity to like notice, like, oh, I want to say that, but it's probably stupid. I want to say that, but maybe my experience doesn't count. All of those are internal judgments, and it's the best place to start practicing not judging others, is to start with self-compassion, to start with self-awareness, so that we can interrupt judgment when it happens externally or when you see it amongst other people. Okay. And the last one, Jess did not tell you this piece of their professional story, but I feel like it's really important for the rest of the day. And that is that Jess does wilderness and equine therapy. That is their primary modalities. And we just got back from an experiential education conference. It was rad, I'm going to be honest. There were very few PowerPoints and a lot of moving and laughing. That's not usually what happens at conferences that I attend. But there's like an inherent value amongst experiential educators around challenge by choice, which means this is, again, your opportunity to feel your stretch zone, not to like stay in what feels safe and not to push yourself where you're going to have what Brene Brown refers to as a vulnerability hangover, right? But like to really feel into your own edges of like how you want to show up and participate today. And that includes, we're going to get up and we're going to do a lot of different activities together. There's a lot to be learned by being an observer. So if you're often the first one in, being like, I want to be the volunteer, I want to participate first, what is it like to sit back and just be the observer? Is that hard for you? Why is that hard for you? If you're the wallflower and don't like to participate, what would it be like to kind of lean into that participation process? So everything is a choice. We also have no judgment around how you show up and participate. Sometimes I think people are worried about how we're going to feel about it. This is your experience, right? This is like however much you get out of today is your responsibility. We can give you and offer what we have, and then the rest is up to you. So challenge by choice.
We might forget to remind you that like this activity is a challenge by choice activity. This next activity, like at every stage, like this is true whether we remember to acknowledge it or not. And again, that's part of integrating, like how do we change culture to be trauma informed? So this, we could label it rules, classroom rules. We could label it group agreements. We could like the language we use to describe what these are matters though, right? Generally, we talk about them more as agreements or as aspirations than as rules, right? Because rules can accidentally induce a sense of shame. Oh, I broke the rule. I was bad, right? Rather than like, oops, I didn't do that thing, or I forgot how to do it, or I needed more support in order to do it, right? Practicing non-judgment often requires support. There's sometimes where, like with Elizabeth, I'll be like, can we have 10 minutes of just judgment? Because I need to get it off my chest. Because then with that support, I can go back to remembering compassion or coming up with different reasons than my judgmental ones for why something happened. As far as challenge by choice goes, this can be a very experiential process with a classroom. This is about how we're agreeing to be human together. This is about how we're agreeing to learn together. And we try to do things that are like generalizable so that you can take this and do a version of it. In an experiential ed setting, we might get big poster boards or poster sheets and put them around a room or put them around an outside space and have people write different things on them, or we might come up with the group agreements and then have everybody put their hand on it and trace their hand instead of a signature. There's different ways to get physically involved with saying like, yes, I'm doing that. I want to work towards that kind of way of being. On everybody's table, there are some blank note cards. So this is one of the ways that we encourage challenge by choice. We know that not everybody has the same processing speed. Not everybody's an extrovert. So if you have a question or a comment or something you disagree with, we have a basket, a little bowl at the back that you can drop comments and questions in at any point. So if you feel like we moved on too quickly, or if you just feel too shy about speaking it into the space, there's other ways to participate as well. I think that was the last piece around that. I don't think we have, yeah. We're also really informal presenters, and y'all are being like so respectful and sitting there and nodding and smiling, and like I might get up and move around. I'll probably have something in my hands most of the time, unless I'm signing. Please stand up. Please lean against the walls, right? Get up and get food at any point. We do have a lunch break at 12:15 and a regular break at 10:45, but get up and take care of yourselves as well. So the first experiential activity that we are going to do is a relational introduction. And I actually mixed this up. So I did something different today, and I didn't actually talk to Elizabeth about it, so sorry. I handed out little cards. Those are my trauma-informed care cards. They're based off of Wisconsin statistics, but Illinois is probably fairly similar. On one side of those cards is a trauma statistic. Usually something heavy, right? Like, oof, some sort of truth that might be hard to acknowledge. And on the other side is a quote. Usually something uplifting. Something that holds our capacity for hope. that's a metaphor for part of what we're encouraging you to do today as you practice staying present. How do you lean into the pain and the truth and also maintain your humanity and your hope? How do you find that balance as you go through, like, okay, this thing is hard, this thing can help me keep going. So we're going to use those cards actually as a way to encourage you, although you don't have to, because challenge by choice, and to encourage you to find different people to interact with. So the way I will encourage you to find your groups, when we do the small groups, we're going to do groups of 3. And I'm not sure if we actually divide well into 3s, but and I'll encourage you to do that by colors or by color pattern to the best of your ability. You all picked randomly, so I probably don't have the correct ratio of different colors out there, but that's all part of figuring out how we fit in. It's another metaphor. And like how we feel like we can approach or be approached, or like, am I going to be left out? That's a big theme in schools as far as a sign or symptom of how stress and trauma are playing out in somebody's daily lived experience. So the first activity is a relational introduction. Do we have time for this? Do we have a third person? Would somebody be interested in being a very passive volunteer in our role modeling of how this goes? Yeah, come on up. Yay! Yeah, you can applaud. Woo! From the back. Yeah, I'll be the light. Do you mind sitting there? What's your name? Lisa. Lisa, thank you so much. Lisa, I am giving out Schwag to people who participate. Would you like a heat pack, ice pack, or would you like a stress ball? There you go. Yeah, okay. Right. Okay, so this activity is called the mirror, the truth, and the light. There's 3 roles. When we get into your groups of 3, we'll rotate through those 3 roles so everybody will have a chance. Anybody been at a presentation where we did this before? Okay. So the mirror is the person doing active listening. So in this case, I'll have you do the active listening. Is that okay with you? Yeah. So the mirror will initiate a question for the truth. The truth expresses their truth, answers the question as honestly as they feel comfortable. This is another layer of challenge by choice. How honest do I feel like I can be right now? What do I want to share or not share? What might be an edge that I'm willing to lean into? What might be a place that I need to keep a little bit more protected? No judgment, just bringing awareness in. Because choice is a huge factor for trauma-informed care and resilience. So Lisa will ask Elizabeth, who will be the truth, what her experience is about something, and we'll use one prompt. We'll all use the same prompt. And then my role in this case is the light. So we have the mirror, the truth, and the light. And the light observes very without interpretation. The light observes what does the truth do? What does the mirror do? What is their dynamic like? And then we'll give a little bit of feedback. So we're gonna role model this. So are we gonna do our regular question? Okay. So Lisa, I'll have you ask Elizabeth and then engage your active listening, your presence with Elizabeth while she responds. And Elizabeth will have up to 2 minutes to respond. And the prompt is, what is the best part of your work and what is the hardest part of your work?
Elizabeth, what was your relationship like with your father?
That's a really complex question because I have 2. Yeah, I have my biologic father and I have my adoptive father. So super complicated question. My adoptive father is the light of my life, and I lost him 10 years ago. He because I was adopted, he thought maybe I could be a professional women's basketball player until I stopped growing in 6th grade and never hit 5'3". But then he told me about Spud Webb, and maybe I could still be a professional basketball. No, he just believed deeply in my capacity to do absolutely anything I set my mind and heart to. So you're gonna make me teary now with this question. Yeah, and I just met my biologic father 2 years ago on his 70th birthday. Yeah. Was it only 1 year ago? 1 year ago on his 70th birthday. It has been an amazing and super emotional up and down experience because with him came 2 sisters, and I love them with my whole heart. So, yeah, thanks for asking about my dad. Zzz.
I have so many feelings right now. I'm grateful that multiple people are nodding their heads. So, I mean, challenge by choice, the prompt that I gave was, what is the hardest and best part of your job? That is not the question that Lisa asked. Elizabeth had a choice point. This was not planned, and I don't necessarily actively encourage you to totally riff off of what we're encouraging, but that's part of experiential education. So you just got to see us in our true form. And it made me hot. I was like, oh, that was not what was planned. This went sideways. How often do you feel like that happens in the classroom? So in a lot of ways, you just did us a favor. Thank you. My job is as the light, and I'm talking about me. So I'm supposed to be talking out here. But the reality is how I feel filters what I see. So I needed to kind of acknowledge the heat and the feelings going through my body first. I had no idea what Elizabeth was going to do. But I also heard so much care. The tone of voice that you used when you asked that question could have been snarky as far as like poking back at what we were doing. Could have had some, but I felt a warmth to the question and an openness. And I also felt and noticed the way that you softened into that, even though you had a non-traditional answer. Well, I have 2. I have 2 fathers.
I did this first.
You did brace for a second in that choice process. Yeah, I saw a lot of nonverbal and even some slightly audible engagement, nodding your head, leaning in, smiling, some O's, acknowledging and showing that you were staying with Elizabeth, even with the curveball, right? And yeah, so those are the things that stood out to me. I could keep going. There's a question in the back. I'm gonna repeat it. Yeah, so there was I'll repeat that. So there was a nonverbal process that once she decided to actually answer that question, Elizabeth leaned in and made physical proximity, more contact. Gave herself a little bit of support with her own elbow. And at the end, kind of exhaled and leaned back, So non-verbally gave an acknowledgement of like, that's all I'm going to say, or I feel complete in some sort of way. So some of what I said had some interpretation. Some of it was just observation. As much as possible, we want you to practice staying in observation. If you go into interpretation, do your best to acknowledge that. Say, you might have felt complete. I wonder if you felt complete, right? Feeling complete is an interpretation. That is either Elizabeth's experience or it's not, and I don't actually know. But I do know, like was pointed out, that she sat back and exhaled. That's an observation. Okay? And then we would rotate and start the process over. So part of this process is we actually have to interrupt you every 2 minutes to keep you moving and to really have the experience of everybody getting to be in each role. So well, actually, give a round of applause to Lisa. Thank you so much. You're welcome to go back. How do you all want us to get the group's attention? The flashing of the lights are not very effective in a conference room. That's like a long pause and then they slowly turn off. And then you turn them back on and they're like glitchy and they come on. So we often use lights, but it's not a good room for that. How are we going to get the group's attention? Some sort of visual timer, okay. I saw another hand. Was there another idea? Yep, raise your hands, okay. Oh, we can wiggle the projector. Yeah, maybe flash with the projector. Okay. I see several heads nodding with that. That's like the visual timer concept. Okay, great. And then we'll rely on the rest of you to kind of help bring your group back in. So the time frame for this is the mirror will ask the question. The question prompt that we encourage is, what is the best part and hardest part of your job? The truth will have 2 minutes and to answer both or one or some combination, however they want to answer that question. And then the mirror or the light will have 1 minute to reflect back the observations. What did they see about the dynamic? Any questions about this activity? Okay, so the last tip that I'll give you all is that sometimes people get disoriented in the rotation process. So there's a couple different ways we encourage people to rotate. You can imagine like the roles rotating, like a little dial moving above you. You can assign one seat to the role. Like that can be the mirror seat and that can be the truth seat and this can be the light seat. And then you literally like move your bodies to the other spot so that it helps you orient. You'll have to decide that in your small group, how you're gonna do that. Maybe one person's like, I just will keep track and tell everybody. That happens too. There's several different ways that we function as groups, small groups. As far as visual and audible access, we do encourage people to kind of spread out in, so that there's a little bit of space. If anybody ends up going out into the hallway for better auditory access, just kind of try to pay attention or maybe set a timer for yourselves to stay on track. Okay, so now what I had said before is true, that you will use your colors as an encouragement, not a requirement, but an encouragement to find new partners based off of the color or color pattern. Organize yourself into groups of 3. Go ahead. We won't start the activity until everybody's organized. Take a moment to just share names and figure out the first role. So you're welcome to use those cards either as part of the like, hi, my name is Jess and I feel like I need hope today, so I'm gonna read my little quotes. You can use that as part of your introduction. You can use it as space filler in between the different things if your group runs short of time. Use those cards however you want to support the conversation. But names and figuring out who's in the mirror, who's in the light, who's in the truth role. For groups of 4, there will be 2 lights at the same time. There will be 2 observers at the same time. Okay, go ahead and take about a minute to do brief introductions and figure out the first role that you're each in. Everybody wrap up. find an ending for our relational introductions. Okay. Attention up here. All right. I know I'm doing a good job when you stop listening to me. A huge part of trauma-informed care is facilitating relationships that people want to be engaged in. So the fact that most of you were still talking over me, it's kind of a good thing. Right. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and you can just raise your hand. Anybody feel more connected after that? Anybody feel like 2 minutes was not enough time? Anybody feel like 2 minutes was way too much time? Well, I usually have a few people in a group. A couple people. You're being shy back there, of course. Yeah, everybody has different experiences. So even though this is intended to be a fairly universal process that will generally increase connection, generally increase a sense of ease or calm, it won't always. That's part of the experiential process. And that's part of taking the time to ask questions and check in. So again, taking a moment to think about, like, how often do I actually get to check in with my students? How often do I get to check in with my colleagues about how they're doing? How often do my colleagues check in on me? What do I do or not do to encourage that or discourage that? Right, there's all sorts of things. Anybody in particular like the mirror role, that getting to be the active listener? Okay, anybody really like being the truth, getting to share their answer? See some head nods, yeah. Anybody like being the light and just doing the observation piece? Okay, yeah, pretty evenly split in there. Anybody like it all? Yeah, good. Okay, so thank your partners and go ahead and wander back to your... All right, we're gonna keep going here. Okay, so we're gonna do a whole group debrief really quickly here. That was a little microcosm. That was a little experiment. We have time for 2 or 3 takeaways, observations, things that really stood out to you from that experience. I'll bring the mic over to folks.
I have to work really hard at just listening and not jumping in with some related experience of my own. And I'll thank my husband for that, for reminding me of that it's not about me. And even if I have a very similar experience, this is not the time.
I heard a lot of affirmations in that. Yeah, like, oh yes, sometimes it's not about me and it's not the time. Just active listening goes a long, long way. Who felt really supported by the active listening? By the lack of interjection? Yeah, okay. There was a hand over here. Yes.
I just noticed at least once or twice I had to change my you statements to I statements. So that's a habit I have.
Good, yes. So the first person who shared over here did a good job of making I statements. I had to not interject. I had to slow down. You noticed that you had to interrupt your yous. In our longer trainings, we spend a good chunk of time talking about the difference between you statements or the royal we statements and switching it to I statements. Linguistically, you statements and we statements depersonalize it, right? It's a way to not actually feel. But when I say I interject, that's an experience of vulnerability. And when I'm vulnerable, I'm open to actually connecting with you. Yeah, anybody else, any other takeaways? Anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, so during that activity, I was just reflecting on Lisa's question and the choice point that I made in our opening, and how often we assume safe questions or don't think about what is a safe question. And so, right, like asking what my relationship with my father was like could be thought like, oh, well, everybody has a father, so that's a safe question. And Jess and I have both had experiences in the last week or so where people have assumed, like, let's start with the safest level of question and then move into vulnerability. And their assumed safest level of question was actually not safe, right? So, for example, I mean, this is a really small example, but people will often be like, oh my gosh, it's your birthday, happy birthday, let's celebrate, right? And like, with absolutely zero concept that my birthday is the moment of my first trauma, right? And that there might be a whole different feeling around that day for me. Do you want to share your non-safe question or not?
Yeah, so at the conference, one of the activities was like step in if you agree, or like if that's your experience, and step out if it's not your experience. And the second question was step into the circle if you have siblings. My brother and I were my only two kids that came full term from my parents, but my brother died by suicide. And so at this point, I am a solo child, but for a good chunk of my life, I was not. And so it was the second question, and I was like, how do I answer this? That neither one of them are accurate. So I turned sideways. I was like, ooh, that feels good. And it was a really interesting experience because the facilitator saw me and went like, oh, that's an interesting response. And then moved on. And I was like, there was a lot in that response, and it could have been a moment of connection or feeling seen, but rushing through it made it be an experience of not being seen or being overlooked, especially from this assumed safety perspective. So again, this is really important because when we're stressed or when there's trauma, there is a sense of urgency. Our nervous systems literally speed up. So if we're working to do the opposite, we have to take the time to slow down. Whether what would have been that facilitator going, you turned sideways, I've never seen anybody do that before. Right? Like, tell me about it. Or checking in with me on a break. Right? None of those things happened. None of those ways of slowing down happened. Connection and relationship takes time. And school systems, businesses are designed for efficiency. Unfortunately, efficiency can feel like urgency. Right? So differentiating between the two so that we know when we can slow down to interrupt trauma, to interrupt stress, and really promote relationship is a big part of shifting systems, shifting personal experiences. So we're gonna do our first break. It is 10:50, and we were told to give you a 15-minute break. So come back after 5 after 11. Okay. If you want to put any notes or questions in the bowl in the back, this is a great time to do that. We'll check that right before the end of the break. Thank you. There are a couple of center, like aisle tables that don't have anybody at them, and so we're kind of consolidating extra sensory objects, extra coloring pages on those. You're welcome to trade out things over time. Sometimes in the morning we need more stimulus. Sometimes in the afternoon we need something more soothing, or depending on the content. There were a couple of really great cards left in the bowl back there. One of the questions was, how do we check in with students with low language who might not be able to engage. So that might be deaf plus kids, that might be kids who have experienced language deprivation and might not have the range. So a big part of that actually goes back to the experience of observation. So just like with a newborn, checking in can be nonverbal. Checking in can be about our observation skills and having relationship over time to know, what are the cues that this kid is getting agitated? What are the cues that this kid is having a good time? How do I, for some of those kids, transitions can be particularly hard, right? Like if I'm having fun, I don't want to stop having fun because that's really hard, right? So visual cues, images, sensory supports, that sort of thing. And then the other thing that I would say, that's why I do nature-based and horse-based work, because those experiences can go beyond language. And we need tools for beyond language in a lot of these circumstances. Modeling. Yep. Yep. So if we can role model or role play, we can talk about our own experiences. We can do different social emotional learning strategies to really model that or show that. Again, pairing that with visuals, pairing that with certain signs, pairing that with things that support that process for that particular person. Another comment? Piggyback on the question, sure.
So, like, you work with deaf blind students. They don't have access.
Yeah, great. Yes, and with deaf blind folks or people who have don't have access to the visual cues. Again, protactile approaches, sensory approaches that support that process, or different sensory ways to give information about the types of transitions, to give information about the and really building some sense of nonverbal or verbal expressions of emotions, right? So I am actually going to transition to Elizabeth to talk about the Big Feelings book. The Big Feelings book came with this as part of this training, so I believe each site got a Big Feelings book. And Elizabeth and her daughter co-wrote that book. So whether it's a trauma, like whether there's early childhood trauma or whether there's language deprivation or whether there's both, we have found that young kids, including deaf and hard of hearing kids, deafblind kids, might have an insufficient exposure to emotion words, right? Mad, sad, right? Like mad, sad, happy, or excited, right? Like, and the Big Feelings book is a way to expand that language and to build more exposure, and that goes back to role modeling, actually, because it's an opportunity for the book to actually be like, well, what's the emotion word that I would choose? What's the emotion word that your friend would choose, right? Like, that it can be more complex. And it can be more simple. So I'm going to let Elizabeth talk about that resource that you were given.
That was a really good summary. Okay, so yeah, I feel shy. I feel shy about it. And I'm really excited that it's out in the world. And I want to acknowledge a couple of things. This is the first prototype of this book, so we're like already making changes and adaptations. But for Sylvie and I, it was really important that there were at least 2 little pockets, because she often had 2 emotions going on at the same time, and they were often in conflict with each other, right? So she got invited to a birthday party, and she was both excited and terrified, right? She was time to go to sleep. She felt both brave and scared. And she didn't have complex language to be able to explain that she had these two conflicting kind of feelings inside, and what would happen is it would just look like rage. Right. That's what it looked like. So I think that that you can have both of these experiences at the same time is something that kids have the capacity to learn. But as adults, we sometimes fight against that both and feeling or acknowledging our own sort of both ands. And so it really is meant to be a dialogue piece for us to start having those more complex conversations around our really, sometimes very different emotional landscapes. And I think that that's also what was coming to mind with the deaf-blind question, is that our relationship changed dramatically as soon as I stopped believing it was a language issue and started believing that it was her actual experience. Right? So when she would tell me that when she hurt somebody, she felt mad. And I was like, no, you don't, right? You feel sad, you feel sorry. Like, it was a language thing. And she was like, no, like, I feel mad. As soon as I was like, well, that's curious. Let's learn more about why you feel mad when you hurt somebody. And there's probably some very deep trauma layers to when she was hurt as a baby and how she felt inside of herself about being hurt, right? So instead, it just allowed for curiosity and like a different kind of exploration of how is your emotional landscape different than mine? And as soon as I started believing her, things shifted. So and then I want to say one more thing. The other thing that is very poignant and apparent is the little snail, Emoda snails we call them in the book. On some of them, they have the sign for it on the back. And on a significant number of them, they don't. Because we live in an inherently autist world. And so even the kinds of sign language support for kids of very, littles, for parents of littles, is really incomplete and inadequate. So we're working with a deaf artist to redesign all of them and to make sure that they're complete. So I will be sending out a whole new series of those Emoda snails. The proceeds of this book are going to pay the artist to totally change those and make them available. But because I work in Eddie and I work with parents of really little kids, and I see the early intervention system focusing on more all done, please, apple. And I'm like, but there's this whole other experience that these kids are having, and hearing kids get access to those emotion words. How do we start shifting that? Some do, some don't. You're right. Anyway, I want you to know that that's coming. It's not, I'm acknowledging that it's incomplete and it's autist, and we're working to fix it. The other thing that we are working with is a deaf woman who's going to be signing the whole story. So there's a QR code in the back, and we have a bunch of little preschoolers who are signing all of the different emotion words, because kids like to watch other kids. And so that story, we're just trying to find the right time to make that happen. So that's also coming. But in an effort to be perfection is the enemy of good enough or something, right? I'm just trying to get it into the world so that it can start having some impact, and we'll keep perfecting it over time.
A little bit of Elizabeth and Sylvie's story is in the back, and a little bit of my story when I was teaching on the Dene Reservation is in the back as well. But that's another thing. Sylvie was really low language when you decided, she was probably 4. She had one word when she...
She had one word when she came. She had 70 signs before she tried her first English word. And then it came out as a 3-word sentence. Because sign language was a bridge.
Yeah, she was a hearing... She is a hearing kiddo. So from Cantonese to English, ASL was a bridge for her. So... Yeah, I again, modeling our own experiences. This book has the potential to really develop theory of mind and be a reference point for, you just asked that kid to share, that kid is now tantruming. What do you, how do you think that kid feels? right? It can develop perspective taking and be used in teachable moments. And that all of this really goes back to the training principles and underlying assumptions of the way that we do trauma-informed care trainings. That experience shapes who we are. Whether it's that like zinger of a question that Lisa asked at the beginning, like what is your relationship with your father? Right, stereotypical therapy type question. Or whether it is like, did you grow up in a community with community violence? You know, growing up with food insecurity, growing up with teachers who believed in you or teachers who did not, right? Like experience shapes who we are. And every single moment you are having experiences that shape you, even still as adults. And every single moment you have the opportunity to create experiences, or at least recognize the way that your experiences are shaping things for kids. Relationships are really the cornerstone of this work. That's why we start with the relational introductions. We deeply believe that all behavior is communication, right? That behavior is and that's why we do the observation as part of that relational introduction. That the majority of communication is nonverbals anyway. So how do we honor that a little bit more? Sometimes that skill of observation or the skill of recognizing the way that behavior is communication is stereotyped or reduced as intuition. How did you know that that person felt that way? Or how did you know that the kid was about to blow up? Well, there was a lot of nonverbals that happened before whatever happened. So paying attention to behavior. We also really believe that all behavior is an attempt to find homeostasis or an attempt to heal. A lot of Bessel van der Kolk's work really talks about that. If you're familiar with Bessel van der Kolk's work or the book, The Body Keeps the Score. Humans tend to be pleasure-seeking and pain avoidant. It's part of why transitions are difficult. Ending play or ending a positive experience can feel painful. Change is one of the threats to the nervous system. So if I experience change from like, this room is fun, sometimes the lunchroom is scary or overwhelming, right? Like that change can be a trigger, and the behavior will give you feedback about that. But even if there's a trigger, even if there's disruption, even if there's a difficult behavior, that in itself can be an attempt to say, I need help, or an attempt to say, this isn't working for me, right? So it can be functional, especially when we reframe it of like, what is happening underneath. Trauma and oppression are inherently connected. And part of that is recognizing that we all cause harm. This is one of the hardest things for folks who come to our trainings. It's one of the hardest things for me as a therapist. You know, I went in to Teach for America with a little chip on my shoulder after graduating college. Like, I'm gonna be one of those good teachers. Most of us get into helping professions. You're all in a helping profession. Because we want to be part of fixing things. We want to be part of things being better for other people. And we all have moments where we cause harm, right? Because I gave the example of when the facilitator asked, like, step into the circle if you have siblings or not. It wasn't a big harm for me, but I noticed the absence of certain things in that interaction based off of the bias, based off of the assumptions that were made about that question being a safe question or not. So whether or not we have ample trainings in trauma-informed care, whether or not we have sufficient trainings in anti-oppressive or diversity and inclusion efforts, right? Like, we still make mistakes. We still function inside of systems that have lots of assumptions about what's normal and what's not normal. You know, whether that is gender-based or whether that is hearing-based or whether that is race-based, recognizing that there are times where we have to acknowledge the harm that we cause so that we can do repair. Because we all feel that in our body. I was like, I feel so hot. I have so many feelings when Lisa asked that question earlier. What we experience in our body gives us information about what's happening for you, but also about what's happening for me. Generally, and like what happened when that facilitator asked that question about step into the circle if you have siblings or not, he had an experience in his body. I had an experience in my body. Generally, if that experience is one of discomfort or one of like, oops, I might have made a mistake here, or confusion, generally people default to like moving on. We default to urgency. We default to rushing. I could feel him speed up, actually. He started asking questions faster, and I was like, ooh, that's not helping me feel better either. So I had to do a lot of work to slow myself down, even when the facilitator started to speed up, because he was having some feelings in his body. Any questions about these? Okay. I'm going to go through the next ones kind of fast. So ultimately, trauma-informed care is a paradigm shift where we interrupt the patterns of judgment that society or our families have so well re-ingrained in us. And we create internal systems and social systems where we can say, even if I don't understand, I believe you. Right? The shift that Elizabeth was talking about with Sylvie, where Sylvie was saying, I'm mad when somebody else gets hurt, shifting from like, that isn't a normal response. You can't let me teach you what the normal response is, to I believe that you get mad. I don't understand it, but I believe you. All right, we're going to do another experiential. This one, if you are willing to, will require some moving. That's part of why we've been getting rid of tables, so that there's a little bit of space. So it is a 3-part experiential. So if you want to observe, you can observe from where you are, or you can kind of move over to one of the walls to observe. Everybody else, I'll have you stand up and push your chairs in. For this one, I stand for visual access because you're standing. I'm going to SimCom for it too, but the interpreters will still be available, so there's multiple reference points. So the first layer of this activity is I will say walk or stop. That's it. And then you do those things. Any questions? That was a joke. Yes, laughing is okay. Okay, walk. Stop. Walk. Stop. 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 Walk. Stop. Good. Okay, you can look at me if you need to have a better reference. So now we're going to level up. Okay? So the first 2 prompts were walk and stop. The second 2 prompts are clap or stomp. Okay? I know that stomp and stop sound alike, so I'll try really hard to enunciate, but you can also, I'm gonna use different hand shapes too. So instead of stomp, I'm gonna do stomp, so it's a little bit more visually different. So stop, stomp, okay? Walk, stop, stomp, clap. Okay, so if I say clap you, if I say clap, clap you, okay, good. If I say walk, you walk, and then If I say clap, I have not yet said stop, right? Okay. Any questions? Okay. Stomp. Stomp, stomp. Clap, clap. Walk. Clap, clap. Clap, clap, clap. Clap, clap, stomp. Walk. Clap. Stop. Clap, clap. Stomp, stomp. Clap, stomp. Clap, stomp. Good. Okay. Ready to level up? Okay, this is the last level. So now, there was 2 sets of commands. There was walk and stop, and there was clap and stomp. So now each of those meanings are switched. So when I say walk, you stop. When I say stop, you walk, right? The meaning is reversed. When I say stomp, you clap. When I say clap, you stomp. Take a breath. Okay. Clap, clap. Clap, clap. Walk. Okay, good. Walk. Stop. Clap. Clap, clap. Stomp, stomp. Walk. Clap. Stomp. Walk. Stop. Clap, clap. Walk. Stomp. Stop. Stomp, stomp. Clap. Okay, good. Go ahead and go back to your seats. Okay, so we're going to do a group debrief. What stood out? What meaning did that have to you? What was your experience? Yes.
Well, I have the easy job because I was an observer, but everybody was like cohesive and in unison and really trying to stay together and go through the motions.
Okay, so we have an observer seeing quite a bit of cohesion at all 3 steps. Maybe even feeling a little impressed. Yeah. I felt impressed. What else? What else stood out? Okay, I need to bring my things. Go ahead.
So like the level of processing that it took, like from the beginning, like walk, stop, I can do this, and I was like, oh, and I gotta add these 2 more things, and then I was like, okay, wait, but she said stop, so now I have to walk. Like you were just adding on top, and it came harder and harder and harder. Yeah. I was like, maybe I'll sit down now.
Yeah, you wanted to give up at one point. Anybody else want to give up? No, a couple of people. Yeah, this hand was raised first.
I just noticed a lot of people smiling and laughing. So even through the struggle, like people were just kind of like, all right, this is just a fun little, I can be safe in this.
Yeah, so there was smiling and laughing. So this is a really fun one because you made the interpretation that it was enjoyable or that people were having fun because there was laughter and smiling. A lot of people smile or laugh out of anxiety. I see some head nods. Right. There was moments that it was stressful. Each layer leveled up, right? And there was a lot of focus. Yeah. You also had a comment?
I was just going to say, I noticed as I got harder, I had to look down. Like the first 2, I could look up, I could watch people, but I had to look down to think.
That was such a great observation. Yeah. So you looked down to focus. Anybody else look down to focus? Or your eyes closed? Yeah, a few other people. What an interesting sensory modification. Behavior is communication. And eye contact is something that's really important and encouraged for communication in different ways. So this can be something that we reframe. If people are looking away, if students are looking away, might it actually be about concentration? Might it actually be about something else?
And it's also a privilege because you could look away, right? You had visual breaks and had access to that as a coping mechanism.
Yeah. We all learn and focus in different ways. Okay. So what does this have to do with trauma or trauma-informed care? Any thoughts? Yeah. Do you want the mic? No.
Disappearance of the language. I'm sorry. Disappearance of the language and the way you use words like walk, what the word walk means, but you used it as a different meaning. So that can be confusing for young kids too, because the language wasn't there. And maybe because of trauma, their experience is different.
Yes, thank you. That is such a great point, that the way trauma impacts our experience of language. One of the things that happens under stress and trauma is that most of us will lose access to language. Even if we're really high language people. And not having access to language might make the words more confusing. Confusion is also a layer of trauma or stress, right? So I'm one of those people where confusion is actually the most dysregulating emotion for me. I can be angry, I can be anxious, confusion throws me off. Confusion is harder for me to tolerate. Partly because if I'm confused, I'm disoriented, my orientation response is off, I'm like not sure what to reference, right? So I literally get discombobulated. Other thoughts on how this connects with trauma? Yeah. Yes. Yep. So I'm gonna repeat for you. So when there's stressors or traumas like food insecurity or housing insecurity, that the ability to focus is almost impossible, right? So some folks might have opted out and chose to observe because they were like, oh, like engaging will take so much focus, right? Having multiple ways to learn. Look at all these hands going up. I'll probably choose one more, but there's a lot of ways that how kids show whether they can learn or not is actually a sign or symptom of how regulated or dysregulated they are. Yes. Behaviorally, when kids show whether they are able to learn, able to focus, it is a sign or symptom of how dysregulated they are. If I'm saturated with my other stressors, my body is literally feeling full, or my brain is feeling full of my parents fighting, or of not having the food, or of having to, like being a little kid, having to be the one taking care of my little baby sibling, right? Like if my brain is saturated, focusing on math, focusing on language, especially if it's a content area that I struggle with, is gonna be really hard. So the other thing that I like to point out with this particular activity is that because our early experiences shape who we are, for folks with emotional privilege, that's a term I use, but I have not seen in the literature. For folks with emotional privilege, their baseline is like, of course I know what walk and stop means. I've always known what walk and stop means. That's not at all confusing, right? And the rest of the world tells me, you know what walk and stop means? Yeah, you've been doing this forever. We all agree. Consensus reality. But for folks with early trauma, things might have been turned upside down. You know, safety, some things that should have been safe weren't safe. Some things that should have been predictable or we assume are predictable are not predictable. And therefore, take extra effort, take extra focus to be able to fit into the systems where everybody's saying walk means walk and stop means stop. Or we can flip it around and make it vice versa, right? That like once you experience a trauma, it's like that moment where I always thought walk meant walk and now walk means stop and I'm so confused. So from a trauma-based perspective, that disorientation is an experience. You had your own experience in your body, but it's also an experience of resilience in this activity. Because one of the things that was talked about was with focus, I could do it. I could start to orient to the new normal. I could start to fit. It took time, and smaller doses might have helped you learn it better over time. The other thing that you had the benefit of was a bunch of peers who were doing the same thing. How many of you were referencing other people's behavior? Most of you. Yeah. Yeah. But imagine if you've been referencing other people's behavior and then you go into a setting and you're like, I've been practicing how to walk and everybody is stopping and now I'm like, I don't know if I belong. I don't know if this feels okay to me. Any questions? There's a comment. There's a couple comments. I'll take 2 more comments and then we'll move on.
I also think the traditional way that people teach, you know, you sit and listen or watch, and I teach in front. This activity just kind of reinforces the fact that education should be hands-on and physical, because I feel the more physical one is, the more out of your head you are. You know, you're present, you're there, you're not thinking of, I know trauma is more in your body and stuck, but it just reminded me of exercise and how important non-traditional teaching is, that kids should get up and move because they can be more out of their head.
Yeah. So part of what it's doing for you is that it's creating this philosophical reflection of like, can education be more active? Can education be more interactive? And seeing the benefits of it, or the things that it could support, and wanting that for you and for your students. Yeah.
I was just going to say that I was thinking that when you're doing something that takes kind of like all your brain power and you feel like you have to really focus on it, that I think can be triggering for some people with trauma, because it's a safety issue, right? When you can't be like fully present and know what's going on, like you are feeling discombobulated, it could trigger a safety issue. So an activity that seems fun and silly could be very triggering for some students who experience a lot of safety issues.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it might not even be fun. It might just be like, gosh, I remember 4th grade, my math teacher, or my teacher during math, like we always started math with a 1 minute, do all the multiplication questions as fast as you can, the time test, at the beginning of every single math. And a lot of you, like, some people are making faces, some people are like, oh my gosh, I remember. Like, trauma lives in your body. I loved it. I loved it because I grew up with quite a bit of emotional privilege. And so I had the space to be like, I only got 19 done last time, I'm gonna get 22. Let's go, right? Like, I loved the challenge because I had the emotional and cognitive space to enjoy the challenge. But that is inherently a privilege. Yeah, last comment and then we'll move on.
What made me think about it was that it's more impactful for the kids that we're working with that already are deaf, blind, whatever we're working with, and sometimes other disabilities. They're already struggling with that. Then you add any kind of trauma in it. Because for me, I couldn't do it even in the end. I was trying to copy people, but then I'm too slow. I have ADHD, and I'm sleep deprived and very stressed out. So I was thinking about it, and I'm like, my students who are already deaf and then maybe have something else, and then you add a night maybe where they didn't sleep or they have this trauma and all these things that we're talking about, of course they can't, like, because I couldn't do it. And I could the whole time. I never got better. I was like, this sucks. And I'm like trying to do it, and I'm trying to copy people. Sometimes they were doing it wrong, then I was doing it wrong double, but whatever. And that was just, and yeah. So you have one thing, and then you add the trauma, and then it just makes it that much more worse. So we have to keep that in mind.
Right. Yes. So adding layers of difference. If there is a layer of difference that is real or perceived, that will take a chunk of your awareness or a chunk of your students' awareness because they're navigating all of the social layers of, like, how do I fit in? How do I not fit in? How do I belong? How do I not belong? What am I supposed to do? What do I want to do? Right? That the term masking comes in here. It's a common term nowadays, especially referring to the autism spectrum or neurodiversity, that, like, it takes a lot of energy, and a lot of kids will code switch into what's expected, and behavior is communication, right? So maybe in the mornings they're like on it, but by the time afternoon comes, they're having a lot of struggles because they're worn out. So yeah, all of the layers go in here. All of the diversity layers, all of the trauma layers, all of the social emotional learning layers intersect with this.
I was thinking about how much more exhausting it was when the rules switched, and I just had a moment of thinking about listening fatigue and how much more brain intensity that took, and when we're multicultural or switching languages or all of that, how exhausting that can be.
Yeah, how exhausting. How exhausting. Trauma is exhausting. Yeah, which is part of why we need to slow it down, because we need more brain breaks. We need more social connection to reinforce and fuel the motivation to keep learning, the motivation to express our needs. I'm going to move on. Masking. Masking is being able to do what's expected, even if that's not my impulse, or even if that's not my baseline. So I can be like, basic masking is going to the grocery store when you're stressed out and sleep deprived and have ADHD and maybe frustrated about something else, and the clerk saying, "How you doing?" "I'm fine." Masking, right? Internal state, not good. The perception and the social engagement says, "I'm fine." And most of us are pretty good at our body language matching that. Masking. So, or for people who experience the world from a neurodiversity perspective, whether that's like ADHD, squirmy, or whether that is anger issues, being able to button that up and sit still, or to like just fidget in a socially appropriate way with a little tiny thing under the desk, so that the outside perceives that they're sitting still, that they're focusing, but inside is actually taking a ton of effort to actually mask and perform in that socially acceptable way rather than actually learning. Thank you for asking that clarifying question. We're going to go through these really, really quickly. Do you want the mic? I've been holding it a long time. Okay. So ACEs, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, really incomplete, but helped really make it more universal and understood that like this is a way to quantify how pervasive trauma is, and that trauma changes everything about our life, or can, right? Changes our health outcomes, changes our risk factors, changes our behaviors. So if you're not familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or some of the additional studies that have come out since then, I strongly encourage that you do that. The original study showed that 1 in 6 adults experienced 4 or more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And of the 10 questions that were used in that, one of the ones that was not included was the death or loss of a primary caregiver. And that's significant for an adoptee. The number of foster and adopt kids that come through school systems who've lost literally a caregiver, or since the pandemic, some of you might be familiar with the number of kids who lost primary caregivers as a result of COVID. And that's a significant trauma that isn't even included in that 1 in 6. So what is trauma? This is really important because trauma is a buzzword. And sometimes people get really lost in like, what is trauma? What is stress? You're just using the trauma word, like the trauma card, like, people can get really agitated about trauma-informed care can sound like a quote unquote get out of jail free card. Well, that person has trauma, so we don't ever hold them accountable. That's not what trauma-informed care is. It's holding them in mind.
So we have several different definitions of trauma because different ones will resonate with different people, right? So we've sort of combed through the literature and the books, and we've included just a few. So this one is a pretty common one. It's from SAMHSA. And it talks about an individual trauma results from an event, a series of events, or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, and all of these different kinds of functioning. So that's a pretty inclusive definition of trauma, and it really focuses around the event or series of events. Oh, all right. Well, I'm just going to give you 2 other ones. One is a quote by Gabor Mate. Are any of you familiar with Gabor Mate's work? He's really wonderful and has had one on ADHD, one on addiction, really addiction as an attachment issue. And what he talks about is that trauma healing can only occur in the presence of an empathetic witness. And so one of the things that we talk a lot about is how every relationship has the capacity to be therapeutic or not. Like, you don't have to be therapists to have therapeutic relationships with your students. And the way you show up can be inherently not therapeutic, right? And if you can't do anything else, remember the name of this presentation is Don't Just Do Something, Stand There. Being an empathetic witness to somebody else's pain or trauma is one of the most profound ways to experience healing. Okay. The other one is trauma is an event that overwhelms your body's ability to cope, whatever that is, and it sort of gets stuck in the body. So I'm guessing that this doesn't surprise you. The more you as a provider interface with people, kids who experience high levels of trauma, the more we are at risk for our own vicarious trauma, that our own nervous systems, because we are wired in relationship, right? We are wired as social beings who reference safety off of other people. So if you have a whole classroom of kids who don't feel safe, your own body is is sort of referencing that, and you can be impacted by that, and that can lead to burnout, compassion fatigue. What am I doing with my life? Sort of questions. So I think one of the steps of trauma-informed care is to both acknowledge that we sit in close proximity to other people's pain all day long, and that it impacts us, that we're human in this work, and that we deserve to be recognized for that humanity. Go ahead. So use your fidgets. Yeah. Yeah. And so healing happens in relationships. And so becoming a trauma-informed school has lots of different layers, right? And you are probably primarily only responsible for yourself. That's what you inherently have any sort of capacity for control over. And you work within systems, and so the way that you show up, the way that you behave with colleagues and with students can influence other systems of care as well. We can just keep going. Oh, so here's Gabor Mate's quote, and I don't have his beautiful, where is he from? Budapest? Yeah, he's Hungary. He's got a very nice lilt to his voice, so I'll just let you read it instead. Oh, really? Okay. You want it?
Trauma does not reside in the event that induces physical or emotional pain, nor even in the pain itself, but in our becoming stuck in our primitive responses to painful events. Trauma is caused when we are unable to release blocked energies to fully move through the physical, emotional reactions to hurtful experience. Trauma is not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathic witness. Trauma is not what happens to us, but we hold inside in the absence of an empathic witness. This is a huge part of why multiple people can experience the same trauma and have different outcomes. Right? Because we have different concrete and social supports. And as a attachment and trauma therapist, a big part of that includes like, do I have a partner who can be an empathic witness? Do I have parents, caregivers who can be empathic witnesses? Can I be an empathic witness to myself? Right, like what are those internalized voices, internalized narratives? And how do I treat myself in that process as well? The SAMHSA is a common mental health and trauma-informed online resource. They have 4 R's of trauma-informed care. We've added 3 because we're overachievers. So when navigating trauma, when trying to implement trauma-informed care, whether you're in a hospital setting or whether you're at home with your own family or whether that, whether you're with your extended family for the holidays, or whether you're in your classroom, the first thing is to realize how pervasive trauma is. To recognize the signs and symptoms, right? We've been talking a little bit about the signs and symptoms of like dysregulation, of not being able to respond, of behaviors. Most unpleasant behaviors are a sign or symptom of trauma or stress. To be able to respond with policies, procedures, and practices, like respond on a systems level, but respond on a personal level, right? Going back to my example of being in that facilitated experience of step into the circle if, step out of the circle if, right? If the policy or practice or procedure was to pause, I would have had a really different experience. Much of what we need in our policies, practices, and procedures is ways to check in on people. Ways to check in on ourselves, ways to check in on our colleagues, ways to check in on our youth, ways to check in on the families. And then the 4th one that SAMHSA talks about is to resist, to actively resist re-traumatization. A big part of how we have been modeling resisting re-traumatization is choice, is normalizing difference and diversity. It is acknowledging that assumptions about what will work or what won't work or what will be supportive or what will be triggering don't do any of us any good. That we have to do the relational time, the relational process of being able to go, did that work for you? Tell me why that didn't work for you. Or doing the observational thing with folks who are less, have less language of being like, can I collect more data on when things aren't working or when things are working? Can I create experiences to give me more information about what will support this kid? And then, going back to the principle that we all cause harm, that the next one that we added was repair. That we seek to repair disruptions in relationships. We seek to repair errors. Whether that is more stereotypical apologies, or whether that is accountability, or whether that is systems change that creates more experiential opportunities, that we repair things that don't work, including unintentional harm. On the left side is the word relationally, right? And then we have an arrow that goes back to the top because we're repeating this all the time. Repeating, and I'll throw a new one in there today, and reevaluating. Right? We're constantly given more information about nuances that are meaningful to people. Right? Identities that might be salient, that might have been overlooked. Experiences that might highlight difference.
So I'm going to summarize the 3 things that I feel like are the biggest takeaways so far. One is this concept of I believe you is a super important policy change. What happens if we start from a place of believing students' experiences? 2, this observation with curiosity is a really important intervention. Kid walks up with hoodie overhead, shoulders slumped. I'm noticing that you have your hood up today. Instead of, we don't wear hoods in the classroom. You must be having a hard time, right? There's 6 other reasons that kid could have his hood up that day. What are those 6 other reasons? Bad haircut, right? How do we start from a place of curiosity about what's happening for students? And that we do this all in relationship, which takes time, but we started with a 2-minute relational introduction. And you reported feeling way more connected and ready to participate today after 2 minutes. So time, but not a ton of time, right?
We already took a break, but here's an invitation to move your bodies if you're willing to. Here's an invitation to drink some water, to grab a different fidget, to move around. Again, the norm is to sit still, right? So maybe this is something where you stretch yourself a little bit. What if I'm sitting still, am I wiggling my toes, right? One of the workshops at the Experiential Education conference was a workshop on absurdity. And so maybe let yourself be a little absurd. Move. Grab a different thing that you're I don't know what that is. Grab a coloring sheet if you haven't yet. Let yourself shift and have permission to check in with what might work for you. Yeah, take your shoes off if you want.
Is it okay if I responded earlier if I take my
Yes, yeah. We'll have a lunch break soon, so just getting a little bit of movement in here, because it's in here. Okay, just do that piece. Okay. So we've hinted at it. Some of you have been acknowledging there's lots of types of trauma. There's birth trauma. There's historical trauma. There's chronic trauma. One of the terms that Elizabeth has coined is diagnostic trauma, a diagnosis that forever changes somebody's life or changes the perceived experience. In the literature, and not a lot of people like the literature, but in the earlier literature about parental experiences of early childhood diagnosis of being deaf or hard of hearing, probably relevant for lots of other childhood diagnoses, is an initial grief response. Can be. Not always. There's lots of variables. And that statistic, those statistics that there can be a grief response in parents when a kid gets a diagnosis of any kind, can be really hard, right? Can be really hard to reflect on. But it's important because if the diagnosis is perceived as a threat, right? So if the diagnosis is a perceived threat to my ability to be a competent parent, if the diagnosis is a perceived threat to my extended family being able to connect with my kid, if the diagnosis is a perceived threat to my financial status, if the diagnosis is a perceived threat to my ability to keep my job because of the amount of care that my kid needs, right? If those diagnoses are a perceived threat, then that threat can be experienced as a trauma that interrupts parent-child attachment. And that resurfaces over and over and over, especially through the IEP process. I had a love-hate relationship with IEPs because it was like, okay, let's figure out what this kid needs. I love to include kids in the IEP process. I love to, and often families, you know, even when kids hit milestones that the parents didn't think they would hit, it could cause really complex feelings, right? And often those feelings would come out in the IEP meetings. And there's no space. There's so much urgency in those IEP meetings, right? Social trauma, environmental trauma, intergenerational trauma. There's so many types of ways that we are wounded. Most of the trauma that people experience is interpersonal. Whether that is interpersonal between like family members or whether that is interpersonal with peers. I have a student that I work with that just finally really disclosed the degree of bullying that he's been experiencing, and as a freshman in high school just had to be pulled out of school because he was, you know, silently struggling for so long with the degree of how severe the bullying was. The interpersonal trauma matters a lot, right? Whether that is a mindless comment from a teacher on a bad day, or, you know, I have another student, I'm gonna use this example because it just came to my mind. I have a student who is exceptionally intelligent, could probably skip a couple grades, but gets distracted, has some impulse control struggles, forgets things that have been said, that sort of thing, and got up in the middle of the class to go sharpen a pencil, and the teacher found it disruptive, middle school student, and the teacher made a comment of, "Were you just born yesterday?" Everybody in the classroom knows that you don't use that pencil sharpener. The kids stopped doing any homework in that class. Failed the class because of that one comment from that teacher, lost all motivation, understood most of the content, probably could have gone through without doing any assignments and still pass the test, but failed the class because of that relational experience. So we have 10 minutes before lunch, and I'm going to introduce and go through the 4 I's of oppression. And then we're going to have lunch. Anybody familiar with the 4 I's of oppression? This is one of those models that ends up, I find helpful in helping us weave between systemic or institutional issues and interpersonal or trauma issues. So the 4 I's of oppression is a free framework. There's plenty of criticism out there, but it's a good starting point about the layers of harm that can be caused. So the first layer is ideological. Ideological meaning the way we think, meaning this is the air we breathe, right? So the definition I have up there is that ideological oppression are the dominant thoughts, ways of knowing, and paradigms that are generally associated with values and judgment. So the idea that what is dominant is best, right? So ideologically, the belief that everybody should be right-handed. It's kind of hard to find left-handed desks, left-handed scissors, left-handed, whatever, right? Really basic neutral one. But other ways of knowing that are just kind of the air we breathe, the things that are constantly reinforced, whether we're aware of it or not, are society-based. So in the United States of America, at this point in time, ideologically, we have multiple generations of belief systems, of values about who's better and why. Right? So the way that I like to really reinforce this is to do a little call and response. I'm going to start a phrase, and if you're familiar with the phrase, just shout it out. Finish the sentence for me. Okay? Boys never. Women belong in the. Yeah. So just 2. Did you feel good saying either one of those? Yeah. So there are many things like that are idioms, phrases, colloquialisms that are often at this point, because of political correctness, because of different diversity equity initiatives, that are said tongue-in-cheek or said kind of jokingly, but they're said so often that most of us know them. Right. So if the idea, if we're just going to think about gender, if the idea is that women belong in the kitchen or belong in the home, boys never cry, that really reduces the humanity and expansiveness of who can be what, right? So that's an example of ideology. Once an ideology is dominant, it sets up institutions. So institutions are ways in which policies, rules, laws, and systems reinforce the dominant ideology, right? Any examples of institutional systems that reinforce difference or reinforce that some people get access to certain resources and other people do not? Come on, we're in Chicago. Chicago's notorious for some of these systems. What was that? Policing. Yep, redlining in districts, or school access to different, based off of different zones, not being able to get loans for different populations. Yep. Travel sports. Yep. Yeah. Travel sports get way more financial resources and access, so there's financial differences, right?
So we know that classroom FM systems are good for teachers, their voices, their ability to, right, to like not feel fatigued at the end, and best for hearing students as well as deaf and hard of hearing students, and yet we only put them into classrooms sometimes where there are deaf and hard of hearing students that ultimately make those students feel different or othered.
Yes, Lisa. Right.
And so we're encouraging, oh, there are resources and resources, but some of the resources that people need, there is no access.
Yep. So access to resources. During the pandemic, many hospitals that did hospitalization for mental health treatment were full. Kids could not be hospitalized. Several adult hospitals were actually experiencing the same thing, that people who were actively severely suicidal could not get access to care, right? There's all sorts of layers to this. You know, recently the state of Wisconsin was doing some hearings with the legislature about some decisions that would impact policies and laws for deaf and hard of hearing consumers, and they refused to provide interpreters except for 1 hour of the full day hearings. And for the hour that they were going to provide interpreters, the rule at the legislature is you get 2 minutes for testimony. And when a group of constituents asked for additional time to consider interpreter lag time, to give like even an additional 30 seconds to have equitable access to their stories, they were told no. Institutional. But we want to hear their voices. We want to hear their stories, right? There's lots of messages where the policies and procedures say something different. So once an ideology creates institutions and the institutions reinforce the ideology, then people start doing interpersonal behaviors because it's so normalized. So interpersonally, these are the ways that we treat each other based on the patterns of values and judgments we learned from the ideology and institutions. Going back to gender as a layer, I always was kind of a tomboy as a kid, wore sweats and jeans more than dresses and skirts. I had long hair, but I often had it pulled up in a ponytail. And one day, I was a junior in high school before I really internalized this. I knew but I was just doing what was comfortable. Nobody really gave me a hard time. When I wanted to play boys baseball, my parents made it possible for me to play boys baseball, and people might have given me a little bit of a hard time, but I was never mean. And then I had a moment as a junior in high school where a kid that I thought was a good friend of mine must have been having a really bad day. And I was sitting down next to the lockers. I remember it very clearly. And I was doing some homework, and she came out of the classroom and she looked me up and down and said, "Why don't you ever try? Why don't you even want to be pretty? Nobody's ever going to date you." And walked away. And I went, oh my gosh, something's wrong with me. Right? From an interpersonal gender stereotype. Right? Luckily, I was 16. I had had a lot of foundation where I felt like I could be who I was, and but that shifted things for a long time for me. Interpersonally, it's the ways that we reinforce harm based off of gender, based off of body type, based off of interests, based off of race, based off of socioeconomic status, based off of all of the layers of differences that we have. When the reality is, we are all humans deserve dignity. And this is one of those places where bias shows up. So unfortunately, the interpersonal layer of harm is often the focus of trauma-informed work. bummer. Because there's a whole lot that's influencing why we behave that we do, why we treat people the way we do. Then the last layer is internalized. This is when we start to treat ourselves a particular way based off of the dominant ideologies, institutions, and interpersonal reinforcements. Combined, interpersonal and internalized oppression is where horizontal oppression happens. So this is when trauma and violence within and among marginalized groups happens. So this is something that is important to me to name, because one of the ways that trauma is dismissed in underrepresented groups is that, well, they harm each other. No, that's not really how that works. It comes from a history of ideological institutional harm. Because the reality is, it is hurting people hurt people. And it is easier for me to hurt somebody who's horizontal or near me than to express frustration up the ladder, right? Kids, if a kid has a bad experience with a teacher, they're not gonna go yell at another teacher. They're gonna yell at another kid, right? We don't express our hurt up the power differential. It's too risky, right? That's like, I'm hungry, so I'm gonna go pick a fight with a tiger. The power differential does not make it possible for us to express our hurt and harm where the power differential can actually make it happen, which is why accountability has to happen power down. The variables that really change this on a superficial level are family experiences and personality experiences. But this does not erase the four eyes of oppression. So, I was doing this content once, and a young man stood up and he was like, "You're using all these gender examples. I had a fierce, brave, single mom. I don't associate any of those stereotypes with femininity because my mom was a badass." And I say, cool. I'm so glad you had that different experience. The rest of the ideology, institutional, interpersonal, and internalized experiences are still real for people, right? Same thing with personality. Like, I've had people say, like, again, with a gender example, young men say, I was bullied for being sensitive. I was bullied for crying, right? Like, yes, that was a personality layer, and that does not erase all of the ways that sexism plays out on ideological and institutional ways. Okay? Do I think generationally it's changing? Yes and no. That's a really long question. Really long answer, short question. Super complex stuff. But this framework, I hope that you take back and chew on it and talk about it with your colleagues, because trauma can be interrupted on a personal level. Trauma can be interrupted on an internalized level. And it's harder to interrupt it on institutional and ideological levels, because the people in power need to be making decision changes. The people in power need to have ways to be influenced by people without power, right? We're gonna do an activity after lunch that highlights this a little bit more. But again, there's a bowl in the back for comments and questions. Elizabeth and I will kind of pop in and out of lunch, but you have until 1 o'clock for lunch. Thank you. Okay, so there was one question in the back, and the question was, how do we help students before or after a long break when their home environment is not the best? Elizabeth said that we do multi-day presentations, and I do presentations on all sorts of other content, and sometimes Elizabeth does separate presentations, and one of the things that we present on and I present on is around attachment. And attachment is really about safety and relationship development. So I'm just going to come back to a really brief concept from an attachment model that we reference when we train on attachment. And so the really simple answer to how do we support students before or after long breaks, when they're not getting support, when they don't have good attachment, when they're not in safe places, that sort of thing. Food, touch, and movement. That's it. Simple, not easy. So food, meaning literal food, having snacks, checking in about food, connecting over food, talking about food. Also, food from a more complex metaphorical place, meaning nurturance, feeding them emotionally. Touch, complex thing. I'm a therapist. I'm not supposed to touch under most circumstances. What a weird thing. Humans need touch. But touch is really about feeling touched, metaphorically, making contact, making intellectual contact, making emotional contact, making physical or spiritual contact, right? Connecting, helping them feel touched, letting yourself feel touched by them. And then movement, both meaning like movement in our bodies, moving around, but also meaning allowing the movement of emotions. Emotions get stuck in our bodies, right? Often because of judgment or values. Going back to the boys never cry concept, right? A lot of men struggle to cry, not because they're not able to, but because they've been reinforced to suppress it for so long, right? So being a space where you develop the capacity for a wide range of emotions to be present in front of you. Food, touch, and movement.
So to add to that, name it to tame it. So I think that especially preparing for long absences, to just say, like, I know that being away from school can be hard, or I know that like this long break might be difficult, and then thinking about how to reinforce food, touch, and movement over that break. So there's a concept in infant mental health called angels in the nursery and ghosts in the nursery. And we know that having an angel in the nursery is just one trusted person. That one trusted person can significantly reduce the rate of suicide, right? The rate of self-harm. And that one trusted person can be a real comfort in those long absences. So thinking about food, touch, and movement, like how do you actually create connection during the break? I'm mostly familiar with little kids, so even making like a book of school that they get to take home during the break, being like, how do you allow yourself to feel in contact during the break? And even talking about, you know, what is food like at home over the break? What are your resources? How do you get food? You know, like, I think these are taboo topics oftentimes that kids are not supposed to talk about, these sort of food or insecurities at home. And when you make space for that to be just a like normal part of some kids' reality, you become a place where they can talk about their fear around that, or be able to come back and talk about what actually happened afterwards. But when we don't name it, when it's like this, part of the reason we started with our group agreements is to make secret rules explicit, right? Like, we have a lot of underlying secret rules about how we behave in society, what's okay to talk about, what's not okay to talk about. The more that we can make those secret rules not secret, like out there with a light on it so that you can talk about it, the safer kids will feel, right? Making those available. So that would be my ad.
So those were both just teasers about additional presentations that you could do. Any other questions from the morning content that want to be acknowledged before we move on? Okay, so we are going to do another experiential. I did warn you about that before lunch. So this is another experiential that is a movement experiential. So we'll get up, we'll have some interactions, and it has a couple of layers to it. The first layer we're going to do in here, and then the second layer we're going to go out into the main space so that we have more space for movement. So this particular experiential is called the Colombian hypnosis. The Colombian hypnosis comes from an experiential workshop series, mostly used with actors and supporting actors in being able to pay attention to patterns and to use acting as a way to notice what's going on in social and societal structures. So that group of actors ended up calling this work the theater of the oppressed. So they have lots of different activities from the theater of the oppressed. And this particular activity was developed in the country of Colombia. So the Colombian hypnosis is an activity in which we'll return to our original groups from the Mirror, the Truth, and the Light. So if people arrived late, you'll be able to join a group of 3. And we'll still allow for some observations, but it'll allow for some different role switching as well. So with the Colombian hypnosis, and for those of you who arrived late, challenge by choice, you get to decide the degree to which you participate. Observation counts. So are you leading or am I leading? I'm leading. Look at that smile. Did you see that? I'm leading. Okay, so with the Colombian hypnosis, the leader will raise their hand, and the follower will find a comfortable distance between face and hand. So my job as the follower is to follow Elizabeth's hand, keeping my face at a safe distance, but also at the same distance. So wherever her hand goes, I want to maintain this distance. You want to use your right hand. Okay, so I'm going to put the microphone down, and you'll get to see, because we like to role model. Can't just have you all do it if we're not willing to do it, right? So this is what the Colombian hypnosis looks like. Any questions? Okay. You got to see me be flexible and a little awkward. Everybody's going to lead a little bit different. Everybody's going to follow a little bit different. So you're going to go back to your groups of 3. We moved some more tables out of the way so that there's some space. Any questions?
Remember, when you're the leader, you also then have to be the follower. So just keep that in mind.
We will take turns. Yeah. Okay, so go.
What are the experiences of the people who are in the groups of 3 that are not?
Yeah, so if there's groups of, so clearly it's a paired experience. So the third or fourth person will watch, observe, and then you'll get to try with different people. So what is it like to lead one person? What is it like to lead another person? You're welcome to try on some different leadership strategies or following strategies.
And the duration of time that
Yeah, I mean, we did that for what, 10 seconds? It can be relatively brief. So like 20, 30 seconds, switch, and then 20 to 30 seconds of leading and then switching. Go ahead. haven't started, go ahead and start. Wrap up. Find a place to stop. In your small groups, take a moment to discuss what this was like. Share in your small groups what it was like, what you saw in other groups, what you felt. Wrap up your conversations. Find an ending. Thank your partners and return to your seats for a moment. Okay, back to the whole group. One of the things that I love about facilitating is to see how different groups are. Y'all are a unique group, doing some things differently. That's okay. Maybe even good. Probably good. So, as a whole group now, you had a chance to debrief as a small group. What are some takeaways? What stood out to you? Maybe I can hear from somebody who hasn't shared yet.
I had a hard time leading just because I didn't want to throw the other person off. And like, I didn't want them to feel like, I don't know, I didn't want to give them something they couldn't expect in a way.
Thank you for sharing. Anybody else hesitant in their leadership? So many, yeah. Isn't that interesting? You have chosen professions that are inherently leaders, that require leading. Leader read. Thanks. Oh, my poor brain. And maybe doing an activity like this with youth would feel different than with colleagues or peers.
We talked about that and like the inherent power difference with doing that with a student.
Yeah, you thought about it as far as like bringing it in with students and how it would be different in that way. Great. So, yeah, I'm going to come back there in a second. So I just want to add, you know, this is such it's such an important awareness piece for us around the hesitation, because it connects back to one of those initial principles around the fact that we all cause harm. And as well-intentioned professionals, the desire to avoid that can interrupt our engagement. How many things do we not say because we're afraid of saying it wrong? How many times do we not engage because maybe that's sensitive? Right? And it's partly a practice thing as far as like, how do I learn to be able to say the hard thing or ask the hard question or develop some comfort in being able to go there? Many people just haven't been given the chance to learn those skills. But as teachers, as professionals in schools, because there is a power differential, because you are the reference point for the room, kids want you to be able to lean in. It's a really interesting conundrum. So there was a question or comment over here, though. Oh, I covered it? Sorry.
I was just going to say that I'm kind of known for being blunt. People think I'm blunt because I will ask the hard questions. And what's interesting is that usually the person I'm asking is not uncomfortable because I ask it in a caring way. But sometimes the other people are uncomfortable. They'll be like, I can't believe you asked that question. It's like, but it was an important question.
Yeah, it's such a dance. There's such an art to this, because there are ways that we can ask or comment that do feel invasive or do feel overwhelming, right? And there are ways that we can ask or engage that give choice or just create an opening. I lost my train of thought. Yes. Sure, please fill in. Yeah, I'll march right on over.
So our group really made an observation of how we all ended up in a situation that we were not expecting while we were doing the activity, where we were like backed up against the wall and had to start moving our other person back, and how we, as these functioning at our level adults, we coped and we communicated, and we were like, I'm gonna move slow so I don't whack you in the face. I don't like this. I'm really uncomfortable with this activity. I'm gonna just keep some extra distance. And we all just naturally like outed ourselves with our discomfort and what kind of coping strategy we were going to use to like power through this activity. And then we said, but what about our students? They would not necessarily have all of the different capacities that we enabled to make this work. So, or even give them the choice to participate. Absolutely.
So many layers, so many metaphors. We have time for one more comment before we do the next layer. Anything else that stands out, or any comments about how this connects to trauma-informed care in schools? Lisa. Yeah, let's do it, Mike.
I think it connects with the beginning when we were first talking about trauma, and it all boils down for me as trust. there's a level of trust that's lost when you're not in control. If something has been consistent for a long time and you change it, now do I trust you, or can I trust you with my emotions, with my thoughts, even with my behavior, because you changed something on me that wasn't expected. And so doing this activity, we knew what was expected, but the person that was in control, or the leader, was leading us in a direction where I'm trusting you in this moment, but you may do something that will make me not trust you, and that's going to cause trauma. Change causes distrust, which is a form of trauma.
You can all go home now. Yeah, I mean, trust and control are inversely related. Yeah, which brings us back to another sign or symptom of trauma. Controlling behaviors are a sign or symptom because of the difficulty in trusting, right? And trust is a really funky one as a professional counselor, because there's complexity to it. So yes, like predictability is an important layer of trust, and change can throw that off. But if I'm in a relationship with Lisa, and where, you know, I think I can expect what Lisa's gonna do, I think I can predict the way that she's reliable, and then she does something different that throws me off. Let's say I find Lisa to be compassionate and reliable and available, and then one day she's just grumpy and it throws me off, right? Then the other layer of trust, especially as adults, is, can I trust myself to respond? Can I trust myself to be like, I didn't like that? Can I trust myself to speak up for what I need? Can I trust myself to adapt? Right? Because then the blame comes off of the other person, and y'all get to still have humanity. Lisa gets to have bad days. There's space for compassion when I also consider myself as an active participant in how I create safety. Okay. Oh, sure.
Hello. So we work in a therapeutic day school, and generally we're able to give our students like choices and options and kind of run on their timeline and what they need and that type of thing. But especially with transitions like going home, there's a time element, right? And so we have to like get them out the door, or whatever the case may be. And some students we spend like 45 minutes before their van comes getting them ready. Other students, we don't get them ready till the last second because it's just better for them, whatever it is. But there are some students that we have to like use CPI and physically like get to their transportation to get them where they need to go on time. Do you have any suggestions for a more trauma-informed way of doing that? Like we count down, we explain it, we tell them what we're doing, they're with people they know. It's in ways we do every day, but it's still, like there's a lot of fight back, understandably, but if we need to go, we need to go. Like a fire drill or anything like that.
It depends. Yeah, every kid's different. I mean, you're already acknowledging that every kid's different. So this is a really complex question, because like the variables that are going into why those kids might be having the reactions they're having, you may or may not be aware of those. If they have vestibular components to their developmental differences, like transportation might just be like inherently uncomfortable. Right? Like you can't reduce that variable, especially for littles, right? One of the things that came to my mind, though, I have a family that I work with. They started working with me when the kid was about 6, and they came to me to do equine therapy. And the little girl was diagnosed with autism pretty young, and I work with a number of kids with a lot of differences, And she showed up at the farm and was like on the other side of the barn before I even said hello. And like when we started doing the tour, she was like inside the paddock with the horses before I could start a safety conversation. And so I paused the family and I was like, listen, I'm cool with working with your family and with this kid. I'm sure she's rejected from a lot of different services because her impulse control and her ability to hear commands to stop around safety are really low. As long as you understand that she is inherently high risk. Like I have great horses. The horses adapt to people with differences way better than humans do. More likely than not, they're gonna be okay with her, but like she's doing things that are high risk. And so for the first, they agreed to it. They were like, we still want to come. The first handful of sessions, she never got on top of a horse because she was just like all over the place. They were having to do a lot of physical restrictions, a lot of physical restraints. The first time we got her on a horse, her whole body relaxed. And she slowed down, and her parents had like been supporting her, and she was able to communicate that she wanted to do it on her own, and so they let go. And I often don't do hard conversations with kids until they're on a horse because the horse helps make the conversation possible. So once she had been in that rhythm of being on the horse for a little while, I was like, hey, kiddo, do you like it when your parents grab you? No. I knew that answer, but I wonder why they feel like they have to grab you so much. They do it sometimes and not other times. And she was like, I don't know. And, perspective taking and conversation skills were pretty low, but on horseback, she was able to have a moment where I facilitated her asking her dad, why do you grab me so much? And her dad said, because I'm afraid that you're going to get hurt. And part of my job is to protect you. And because you don't listen so often, I feel like I have to do more to protect you. And you know what? I don't want to have to grab you either. That was when she was 6. She just turned 9. She's had to be restrained twice since then at the farm. So, it's about relationship and ways that we can support kids to integrate information. To this day, she's one of the top 2 most high-risk kids that I've had in my equine therapy program. But I just use that as an example because it is possible to interrupt, but it really requires situations where we don't have to be so protected. Like if I'm braced, we'll get into this in a little bit, if I'm braced, ready for having to restrain, all of the mirror neurons in a kid that says this is about to be a scary situation are all gonna fire, right? Because nobody likes restraining a kid. And the way that we anticipate that, the way our stress hormones come up, kids can pick up on those subtle cues in us just as much. So, and timelines ruin everything. Yeah. One of the things that what's the quote I always do about time? Oh, time is the enemy of relationships. Time is the enemy of relationships. When we're pressed for time, we stop doing the relational, considerate things. Okay, so we're gonna go out to the main lobby area, and we're all just gonna get in a big circle, and then we're gonna facilitate the second layer of this activity. There will be space for people to observe out there as well. In fact, we need people observing for this next layer. So we're gonna do the second layer of the Colombian hypnosis in the big lobby area out there. Who liked leading? Who liked being the leader in the Colombian hypnosis? It was okay. Who liked following? Some people liked following. Who liked both? Anybody like both of the experiences? Anybody really dislike the whole thing? Yeah. Some experientials are designed just to give you an experience. Yeah. And this is one of those that is intentionally developed because how you experience it is deeply connected to the rest of the experiences you've had in your life. There are ways that it really highlights risk and power dynamics and communication issues, right? So people who were on the outside, people who were only in the observer roles out there, what did you notice? What did you notice in yourself? What did you notice in the dynamic? You noticed anxiety in yourself?
I noticed that Kim was basically the center of everything and it controlled everyone else's movement. So there's always like a core power.
Yeah, Kim had the primary power. Yeah.
Just added levels of chaos.
Added layers of chaos, added levels of chaos. Okay.
I felt like specifically anxious and empathetic towards that second layer, like the person who was trying to follow and trying to lead people. I was just so uncomfortable for them.
Yeah. Yeah. So anybody else have that experience as far as just like deep empathy for like, oh my gosh, following and leading and following and leading and following and leading? Feel familiar to your day-to-days? It's has a lot of parallels to teaching and school and direct service work. Yeah. How about the people who were on the periphery at any layer? The people who were the last layer. What was your experience? What did you notice? Yeah, Lisa. Anxiety of what could happen. Yeah.
It was kind of dual. One, my responsibility in making sure I stood away from her hand because she was so focused on where she was being led. And maybe, I don't know, it's kind of an assumption, but it felt like to me that she was not aware of where she was leading me because she was focused on where she was being led. So a little bit of uncertainty, but then my role in, okay, I have to make sure I'm keeping a safe distance to keep myself safe.
So many metaphors. Yeah, the importance of keeping yourself safe, the importance of paying attention to how distracted your leader was. You know, that's a big thing. The way that we can track, are you actually leading me? Do you actually have the capacity to pay attention to what's happening right now? Right, like kids are tracking for that all the time.
I like how my leader acknowledged that she was not able to keep track of what in the hell she was telling me to do. She goes, I have no idea what I'm doing to you right now. And I was like, cool, glad to know.
So much becomes unconscious when we're really focused. Yeah, but feedback, at least acknowledging, yeah, that goes to that, like, we all cause harm, but what happens if there's even just a little bit of relational acknowledgement?
And for me, sort of the opposite of you. I got hyper focused on what I was supposed to be doing and forgot that the person that was following and leading was also supposed to be following. So we ended up getting broken off from the group and she's like, I'm supposed to be pushing you this way. And I was like, oh, sorry.
Right, yeah. When it got discombobulated, it fell apart pretty quickly. Yeah, it was hard to recover. Yeah, people who were leading and following. Any comments about your experience? You could only do one. Either you were leading or you were following, even though functionally your body was in both. Yeah. Anybody else?
I feel bad saying this, but as an observer, I got the anxiety that everybody did too from seeing everybody in there, but I also wanted to see what happened if they went.
Sometimes we have some morbid curiosity. Yeah. Yeah, no, thanks for your honesty. Yeah, I'm guessing you weren't the only one who were like, I kind of want to see it. What will it actually be like? But that fourth layer, people were back to back, and I was like, oh, there's like it's just cogs are already jammed. There literally wasn't space for movement.
As a person in that last layer, I was already weighing my opt-out options. Like, at what point do I just vacate the space and not participate?
Yeah, and Lisa had already quit, and I made her come back in. Yeah, all right, last layer, center leader. Any comments?
At first it was fine, just two people, and like I said, I felt loyalty to my partner this morning and felt a little bad for her, and then every layer my anxiety went up, like I was responsible for more people, and it reminded me of school. Every layer, every kid, every plus, deaf plus, and then the allergy, and then the behavior. So it's a lot to manage and a lot to like keep up at the same time.
Yeah, it was a lot. And your empathy was keeping you engaged. And even with your empathy engaged, you still followed the directions to lead. And you kept moving. Every once in a while you paused, but you kept moving. Did anybody observing notice the times where she closed her eyes? No. Did you notice that you closed your eyes sometimes? Yeah. It's not just anxiety, like towards fear. Yeah. What are the implications of this? What's the metaphor? How does this relate to the way things are moving? The way systems of power play out in schools? There's a trickle-down effect. Yeah, so, and it's not just a trickle, right? So on the people who were on the periphery had to move exponentially faster than you were moving, even when you were moving slow. I see some head noddings. Who's on the periphery, metaphorically, in your work? Who's having to move faster to keep up? The kids. Yeah. The more complexity, the more they have to adapt to keep up, or the more they choose to opt out. Right?
In some ways, I feel like even farther on the periphery are the parents. So I come from the system of early intervention where families are sort of in the center, and then they go to school where sometimes they're not the first to know, like the student knows even before the parent knows. So I don't know if that feels true for all of you, but
Did this dynamic feel familiar? Kim, you said like, yeah, this reminds me of every day working at school. Anybody else feel like it felt familiar? Yeah.
I think the movement piece though makes it more what if she could have just stood still and maybe directed, it would have been not as chaotic and dangerous and crazy. So if there's a way to slow down, like everyone had to follow her. So she moved, they had to move. But if one person can stop and slow things down for your student who's on the periphery, then maybe you can have a little bit of less chaos.
So you're starting to think of solutions or variables or things that can change. Yeah. Ooh, look at those hands that went up in response to that.
You had said the more layers we got, the more clogged the cogs became. And I think if we think about school and education institutionally and as an entity, that is real. Like the more layers of the students, the more layers of the adults, the more layers of the complexity, like each piece makes that whole system harder to move and change.
Yeah, and the faster it went, the more the more urgency or the more chaos there was, and systems have a lot of timelines. There are certain dates for mandated testing. There are certain dates for different requirements, right? Like those sorts of things. So yeah, there's a lot.
So I think like the two things that struck me is like, even though she was the lead, she truly only had control over herself. Everyone had to respond to her, and she then couldn't control the people beyond her. And being where she was in the center as the lead, the further removed she was from being able to manage the people on the far outside.
Yeah. The further removed, the greater the impact in some ways, but the lower the influence. Yeah.
Piggybacking on that, I felt like the more people we had, the longer I had to wait and the slower I had to go, because now I have more responsibility for more people. And it kind of reminds me of like students. The more layers they have, the more wait time we should have, and the more responsibility to meet all their needs.
Yeah, so there's a couple of layers with this. There's dozens of layers with this. But there's a couple that I want to point out before we move on with the presentation. One is that multiple people acknowledge that like they could only focus on so much. They could only do so much at a time. And from a like school systems perspective, it can be really easy to just like start thinking of solutions like, well, if people just slowed down, or if we just did this thing, or if we just, right? My experience in consulting with schools and supporting mental health services in schools is that more often than not, teachers and administrators are like, I can't do another thing. Like, oh my, like, I hear you that gender neutral bathrooms are important, and I just like, I can't put that on my plate right now. I hear you that the bullying stuff is an issue, but I don't know any school that's figured out how to resolve bullying in schools, and so we're still doing it the way we've always known how to do it. That's the familiarity piece. We keep doing things the way we've always known how to do it. That goes back to the ideology, the institutions, the interpersonal, and the internalized. So the more familiar, the more ingrained, the more we struggle to think about ways to actually interrupt the systems that aren't working. So in particular, that brings me to the second piece. I never made a rule that you couldn't talk. For the most part, this ended up being a nonverbal activity. Why? Oh, yes.
I think that would have just been an added layer of like confusion and complication. Trying to focus on what you're going to say, what you're going to do, how you're going to follow, all those.
For some folks, language would have actually made it more complex.
I just know for me, when I'm trying to focus on something, if it's quiet, it's easier to pay attention to that.
There's patterns of quiet supporting focus. Yeah.
I'm going to go back. The model that we were shown was nonverbal?
Yes, it was. I actually made a couple little comments to Elizabeth, but they were pretty quiet. Yeah, the model was nonverbal. Yeah. So there was it wasn't actually a rule. I did not need it to be nonverbal. And I have had a couple of groups who just, for whatever reason, felt like they could talk, and it was a very different experience. But unintentionally, by modeling not using language as part of the activity, you all internalized it that quickly. It's that subtle. And the reality is there's that particular secret rule is very well ingrained in our society, to not speak up, to not push back, to not ask questions. That all is inconvenient. To not express your needs, right? There's lots of ways that that's reinforced based off of race. That's lots of ways that that's reinforced based off of gender. There's lots of ways that this is a very pervasive issue that actually interrupts the things that we most basically need in order to interrupt trauma and support relationships that actually support our capacity to learn and engage. And as you think about that, you can start thinking, like, what else did I do out of habit? Right? Like the activity itself has many layers of familiar things, familiar patterns, and so it reveals those patterns for us, right? So then, if you want to start problem solving, then you have to start thinking about the patterns.
I was going to give Lisa a shout out. She did tell me she had bad knees and not to make her go too low. So she did advocate for herself.
Yeah, Lisa advocated for herself, but Lisa's advocacy made the leader more anxious. Ooh, yep, yeah, man. Ooh. And now you want to take care of her. What is that crap? Right? Like, but this is how it all plays out, and this is how it keeps happening. So,
that feels really important. This like need to be like, I just spoke my need, and now I'm going to apologize to my leaders who are supposed to be making sure that my needs are met so that I can do my job. But I'm going to and I'm really hearing, we often co-present with a parent of a kid who is deaf, and her voice in this is often like, when I come to the IEP meeting, I come prepared to either be the thank you for every little scrap and thing you do for my child. Thank you. Oh my God. Thank you for making sure that somebody uses the Roger pen. Thank you so much for doing that. Or I'm going to blow this place up because nothing is happening and I have to be this aggressive advocate. And neither one of those things is who I am as a person. All I want to do is be able to show up and tell you what my kid needs without feeling like I have to apologize that he has them, or thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing what the bare necessities for him. So I just wanted to pause there because I think that this dynamic happens all the time.
yeah, we'll do one more comment. The reality is that we could spend another 4 hours on this.
Say it's also like a very quote unquote male versus female, where the women feel like we have to apologize, right? And so it just made me think of that. It's a very female thing that we feel we need to do.
You're noticing a gender layer, a gender stereotype in there, or a gender role that's reinforced. Yeah. Elizabeth would extend that to anybody who feels less power, but is going to have more pressure to apologize for things. Yeah. So there's ways that we could keep going with this, and for the sake of time, we're going to just let you chew on it and talk about it and think about it. And
Last thing. One, I want to point out that the leader was never, ever intentionally harming anybody. The whole time she was aware of her responsibility and trying very, very hard. So I want to say that. Plus, we're talking about leadership at a school being the top of the leadership dynamic, but it's not, right? There are other state and federal requirements that are sort of above that leadership layer. So we had 4 layers, and in reality, we're talking about probably minimum of 8 playing out in any actual system.
or 30. Yeah. Okay. little rhetorical question there. Should teachers adopt a trauma-informed perspective? Of course, because all learning takes place in the context of relationships and is critically affected by the quality of those relationships. So as far as experiential learning goes for you, but also supporting the young folks that you work with, we hope that one of your biggest takeaways is that the relationships you build is what matters. There's some research out there that in the experiential education world that statistics and information don't create change. It doesn't matter how well you educate people, unless that education comes with relationships. That relationships change people. So we're going to do a little teaching about the impact of trauma, going back to the objective of signs and symptoms of trauma and tracking for trauma and knowing how it might look different and for different folks in your classrooms and schools.
So you're all familiar with fight, flight, freeze responses in kids or yourself, right? So these are sort of the known responses to conflict. There are, how many more? 4 more? How many do we have up there? Yeah, just put them all up there. That's okay. So the trauma research expands that greatly, and I think it's really important. So the first one is a flock response. So if you sense that you may not be safe, if you think about this in a biological context, the first thing that animals will often do is gather in numbers, right? If you are we do equine therapy, right? If you're a sole horse at the bottom of the field and there's a loud noise in the woods, you will watch them all come together as a flock, right? So safety in numbers. You see this in students all the time, right? When there's a feeling of not feeling safe, all of a sudden there'll be a gang up, right? Okay, so if you, yeah, little kids too, right? If they're feeling afraid, they will hide behind the leg and kind of peek out at whatever might be unsafe. If flocking doesn't work, so these are kind of tiered responses. If flocking doesn't work, then the next response often is to fight. So if you think about, right, kids who are feeling unsafe, the fight response is next. If that doesn't work, it's a flee response. So leave the situation as quickly as possible. So as I'm going through these, I want you to think about students you've worked with or a behavior and see if you can reframe the behavior as one of these responses to, like one of these trauma responses. If flight doesn't work, you'll notice a freeze response. So this can look like doing nothing. This can look like no longer doing homework in the classroom. This can look like, a total vacancy in the affect of a student or checking out. If freeze doesn't work, fawning will work, like total deferential, you know best, I don't know anything, you're right, I don't have an opinion, I don't have a stake in this game, like you just tell me what to do. So I see these responses when I talk about diagnostic trauma all the time, right? Parents were like, sign language, oral communication, I don't know, you just tell me, you're the professional, right? That would be an example of a fawn response. And literally making yourself so vulnerable that whatever the conflict is could annihilate you at any moment. And if that doesn't work, it's faint or fall asleep.
I just wanted to add one thing really quickly around the fawn. The fawn response can be also the kids who won't ever make a decision, right? The fear of making a decision often has some sort of traumatic root or a perceived traumatic root that if I make the decision, the risk of being wrong in that decision is almost terrifying to me. So I'll let anybody else make the decision whether I want to do that thing or not. Yeah, and then the faint or fall asleep. Yeah, like the kids who put their heads down and, you know, are non-responsive or literally fall asleep. And that often is actually in relationship to just the degree of overwhelm that and how saturated their minds are. There is a literal need for sleep in a lot of kids.
So as you consider those behaviors, consider ways in which we've responded to those behaviors, or the words that we use to describe kids who are head down, checked out, not paying attention, that these are kids who are often behavior problems. These are the kids who are being disrespectful, not engaging in class. So are we going to take 5 minutes to just reflect and share? 2 minutes? Okay. So I want you to just think about a scenario where a child had a behavior that you could reframe as one of those trauma responses and share it with your neighbor. So just think about a time where a kiddo had a behavior that you could reframe, maybe all of the kids, as a trauma response, and just share it with your partner.
Wrap up your conversation. Come back as a whole group. I see some of you smiling in empathy, like, oh, Jess keeps asking for us to come back and nobody's listening. Oh my gosh. Anybody have a trauma response to this one? Not a traumatic one. Okay. So we took a little bit of time to reflect and share on this. We're going to do a couple other teaching things here. Okay, so you all were given handouts. We almost always forget to talk about the handouts. The first one was actually a mistake. We didn't mean to include it. But it is useful when thinking about the 4 eyes of oppression. So when interacting with people, understanding the 4 eyes of oppression from a trauma framework, the introjects or the internalized beliefs, this list of words came from Lee, the parent, that we often co-present with, and just kind of making it visual that people can have this internal negative chatter in the background, even when you're interacting with them. So that first one really connects best to the 4 eyes of oppression. And then the next one looks like the image up there. It's called the triune brain. Anybody familiar with the triune brain in here? Couple of hands. Yeah. So the triune brain is a very simplified model of the brain. And it, Dr. Dan Siegel talks about it from the model of a hand. So if you have an open hand and then put your thumb in the middle and wrap your fingers around your thumb, from the side it looks kind of like a brain. It's a little brain model. And it represents, it's easily broken down into the 3 most basic parts or systems of the brain. The hind brain is reflected in your palm. So if your forearm is your spinal column, then the first part of your brain that's actually processing information is your hind brain right in here. And your hind brain is responsible for basic survival. Your heart rate, your breath rate, all of your circadian rhythms, your sleep-wake cycle, your eat, digest, excrete cycle, all of those basic systems, which are both automatic and able to be influenced. Right? Taking a deep breath can influence your heart rate, can influence your breath rate. We can be conscious of those. But under stress, they are automatically impacted. So if information isn't about survival, isn't impacting those basic survival functions, then information goes up to your thumb or your midbrain, which is your emotional brain. So if you're nerdy into brain science, this is where the amygdala and hippocampus are, what the emotion centers and memory centers. So some people will talk about this concept as like adults being an external hippocampus for dysregulated amygdalas in little kids. So the amygdala goes, oh my gosh, snake! And the hippocampus goes, that's just a garden hose, right? Calm, collected, able to have additional reference points. And the little amygdala can go, no, it's really a snake! And the hippocampus goes, yeah, it looks like a snake, it's a garden hose, right? But that's all in that midbrain, the connection between the memory center, the hippocampus, and the amygdala, the emotion center. If it's not particularly survival related or emotionally charged, then our brain will go around to the frontal cortex. This prized possession of humans and of educators. The frontal cortex is impulse control, planning, memory, all of the executive function stuff, right? The ability to execute multiple directions simultaneously or in order. All of that is frontal cortex stuff. So what we know about the triune brain and the development of the brain is that the frontal cortex wires over time. It develops over time and isn't fully developed until at least 25. So what it looks like on a day-to-day basis or moment-to-moment basis with the triune brain is that kids of all ages will go, oh my gosh, I'm dysregulated. They'll flip their lid, and their capacity to self-regulate, their capacity to remember or focus or have impulse control flips. Might look like flock, fight, flight, freeze, fawn, faint, right? Tantrums, shutting down, whatever those different things are. And then this wires in relationships. So I'm not in a learning state when my lid is flipped. But if a regulated nervous system comes in and I can orient to this regulated nervous system, I can bring my frontal cortex back online with support. Right? So quite literally with infants are like, oh my gosh, I'm hungry. And then a regulated nervous system comes in and supports them and are like, yeah, I'll feed you, ideally. And ideally it functions like this. And then they're like, oh, I feel so much better. Oh my gosh, I pooped, right? And then the regulated nervous system comes in and it's like, oh, I guess that wasn't so bad. I got my diaper changed. I'm so tired, right? And then the regulated nervous system comes in and helps them regulate. So the trauma system regresses us. Under stress, we regress. So under trauma or under stress, this pattern that is similar to what infants do happens again and requires that same external regulation system. That's why relationship is so important. To be able to go, yeah, you're just not able to focus today. And they're like, yeah, you're right. I can't focus today. But inside of me, I feel so much judgment that I'm not able to focus, and I'm calling myself dumb because I'm not able to focus. And I know that everybody is gonna be paying attention to the fact that I'm not paying attention, and all of those internalized systems can start going. That shame. Any of you who are familiar with Brené Brown's work and her video on shame or her video on empathy, rewatch those after this. They help integrate. So we really need support. Even people with emotional privilege and other types of privilege who are like well-adapted, well-functioning adults who got bachelor's degrees or master's degrees and are able to maintain full-time jobs, on our bad days, we flip our lids too. And sometimes we mask and try really hard to make it look like we're functioning. But on some days, we just need to We need other people to support us. Because there are 4 primary threats to the nervous system. This comes from the Synergetic Play Therapy Institute in Colorado. The 4 primary threats are: first, physical or emotional danger. Second, the unknown. Every single transition has a layer of the unknown. I'm in a situation that I know. Even if the lunchroom is something I know, even if transportation is something I know, like, there's variables with it that I don't know. The unknown is inherently stressful to the human nervous system. The third one is incongruence, mismatches. We are wired to be able to notice incongruence for basic evolutionary survival. For example, walking through the woods, if the wind is blowing and then all of a sudden the wind stops, animals and humans will go, something just changed. Whether you notice that it's the wind that stopped or the birds that stopped chirping or whatever changed, if it's an abrupt inconsistency, the nervous system will go, I think something's wrong, right? And this is relevant in several different layers. One of those layers has to do with substances. Substances create incongruence because usually people are using substances to cope, to deal with some sort of difficult emotion, and there's an incongruence between what the substance creates and what's happening underneath the surface. So children who grow up in environments with addicts are particularly sensitive to incongruence. Yeah, I've heard dozens of stories where kids could say, at the age of 7, I knew before my dad pulled into the driveway whether he was drunk or not, right? Because there's a basic risk involved with that incongruence. There's a potential for increased violence or surprise with that incongruence. And then the last one is shoulds or judgments. That this is also a threat to our nervous system and unsettles us. So whether you're judging yourself or whether you feel like you might be judged, and judgment is so prevalent among children, this is something that can be really triggering as well. Yeah, anything you want to add, Elizabeth? Okay. So really, this comes back, what's the antidote? Like, the major antidote is presence. Being able to say, I believe you. Being able to say, I'm willing to hang with you through this. Or the presence that's radically self-aware and can say, I really want to hang with you through this, and I'm so stressed out by it that I'm going to like go for a little walk, and then I'm going to come back so I can hang with you through this. Right? Like, I'm going to take care of myself so that I can be with you. And modeling that self-care is part of this. Or I'm going to check in with my colleague, or I'm going to get supervision, or I'm going to, get additional resources to make sure I handle this the best that I can. And that works especially when we're communicating. I'm communicating that I'm gonna seek more, and I'm gonna come back. So the last little experiential is just gonna be at your tables there, because with extreme states, whether that's like towards psychosis, if you're experiencing kids who are having altered states of reality in your programs, or whether that is like extreme tantrums, we often feel stuck. Humans feel stuck when there's an extreme state that we don't know how to shift. So at your tables, I would like you to just notice your hands, put things down, have both of your hands available. And then squeeze your hands as tight as you can. Make your fists as tight as you can. Squeeze them, squeeze them, squeeze them. What happened to your breath? You're like, oh. Your breath stopped. Usually. There's always a few rebels out there who are like, I didn't notice it. But often, tension literally stops our breath. Breath is your most basic thing that you need to stay alive, right? Like, without oxygen, we don't survive very long. So now we're gonna add another layer. Squeeze your fists as tight as you can, squeeze them really hard, and breathe. Let yourself breathe at the same time. What happens to your fists? It's harder for you to keep them as tight. Yeah. Some of you out there were like, I'm breathing, I have to keep it tight, I'm breathing, I have to keep it tight. Right? Because you're rule followers. But your breath still wanted to soften your fists. Right? So even with the familiarity of like being able to fight or the familiarity of tension, your breath can interrupt the tension. And when we interrupt the tension in our bodies, we are literally a different reference point for the students that we interact with. So the last handout, I skipped a couple of them, but the last handout is a little resource about creating a culture of care, a community of care. Trauma-informed care is about going beyond self-care into being able to have relationships that you feel like you can support and relationships that you feel like can support you. So there's a little handout there that references social, physical, intellectual, creative, spiritual, and emotional categories for care, right?
It was a handout separate from the package on the table that you had to pick up. So if you don't have it, I think we can find one for you.
So we encourage you to, I'm just checking the time. We only have a couple minutes left. I see you there. I encourage you to take this as homework, right? Like really think about, what do I need to sustain me in this work on social, physical, intellectual, spiritual, emotional, and creative levels? Who do I want to check in with about what they need on those levels? Do I want to do a small group? Do I want to do a buddy system? Do I want to take this to my supervisor or my team lead? Like, how do I want to really think about creating a culture of care where we have at least moments of slowing down, moments of connecting that can refuel us and interrupt some of the patterns of urgency and therefore interrupt the patterns of trauma?
So I'm going to invite you to think about those 3 basic needs that Jess was talking about regarding food, touch, and movement. If those are the things that kids need to find regulation and sort of connection, how can you think about food, touch, and movement in those different categories? And I'm going to give you even more explicit instructions to find a single accountability buddy. Just one other person where you can at least write yours down, share it with them, photocopy it, whatever, and be like, how can we support each other? Food, touch, and movement. It could be a 5-minute walk. It could be a 2-minute check-in at the beginning of the day. It could be asking about snacks, like, have you eaten today? Like, really, have you eaten today? If not, I've got a drawer full of snacks. Go grab one. Like, just really simple micro self-care things. This is not about, like, let's go to the spa together next weekend. This is about how do you take care of each other in those moments to moment.
So we hope that your takeaways include, but might extend beyond, trauma-informed care is personal, professional, and systemic. You are the most important intervention. You are the intervention. How you breathe to regulate your nervous system so that your nervous system is a different reference point for those who are afraid or struggling. Individual healing is intimately connected to collective healing. Holding space is really how we really interrupt or mitigate trauma, which requires slowing down. And every relationship has the potential to be therapeutic. So we kind of rushed there at the end, sorry. I believe that you were given a little handout for evaluating. We do a little head, heart, thumbs up, thumbs down, and takeaway feedback form. So please fill those out as you end today. And we'll linger a little bit while we're cleaning up for any final questions. Thank you all so much for your attention today.